Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The exhaustion hit different that night. You know how it gets when you've been running on fumes for 16 hours straight at the hospital. 29 and already feeling like 50, working as an emergency room nurse in Cleveland had become my whole life, especially after my divorce finalized earlier that year. The highway stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon, completely empty except for the occasional semi-truck thundering past in the opposite direction. Must have been around 2 in the morning on a Wednesday in late October, when everything went sideways. The radio kept cutting in and out with static, which should have been my first warning that something wasn't right. But honestly, I just figured it was the old antenna on my beat-up Ford Explorer acting up again. All I wanted was to get home, take the hottest shower possible, and collapse into bed before my next shift started in 10 hours. The figure appeared in my headlights about 3 miles from my exit, standing right on the edge of the shoulder, where the asphalt meets the gravel. My first thought was that someone had broken down, which happens all the time on that stretch of Interstate 71 between downtown and the suburbs. The person was waving both arms above their head in that desperate way people do when they really need help, wearing what looked like a dark jacket with the hood pulled up. My nursing instincts kicked in immediately, that automatic response to help someone in distress that gets drilled into you during training. But as I started easing off the gas pedal and drifting toward the shoulder, something made me glance at my rearview mirror. And that's when I noticed how dark the road behind me had become. Like all the streetlights had suddenly gone out even though they'd been working fine just seconds before. That's when I saw them. 2 shapes emerging from behind the concrete guardrail on the passenger side, moving in this weird synchronized way that made every alarm bell in my head start screaming. They weren't running or walking normally, more like gliding forward while staying perfectly parallel to each other, maybe 15 feet apart. The person who'd been waving suddenly dropped their arms and stood completely still, not even turning their head to track my car as I was slowing down. My foot hesitated between the brake and the gas for what felt like forever, but was probably only a second or two. The 2 figures from the guardrail were wearing identical clothing, dark pants, and what looked like gray hoodies, and they moved toward my car with this terrifying sense of purpose, like they'd done this exact thing 100 times before. My nursing training includes dealing with aggressive patients and dangerous situations, but this was something else entirely, something calculated and wrong in ways I still can't fully articulate. I slammed the accelerator so hard my tires screamed against the pavement, fishtailing slightly as I jerked the wheel back toward the travel lane. In my side mirror, I caught a glimpse of all 3 figures standing in a perfect line across the shoulder, just watching my taillights disappear into the distance. My phone was in the cup holder, and I grabbed it while trying to keep the Explorer steady at 90 miles per hour, fumbling with the emergency call button. The dispatcher who answered sounded skeptical at first, probably used to false alarms and paranoid drivers, but something in my voice must have convinced her because she said units were already in the area and would check it out immediately. I kept driving way too fast all the way home, checking my mirrors every few seconds and taking a different exit than usual, just in case anyone was following me. The adrenaline didn't start wearing off until I pulled into my apartment complex and sat there in the parking lot with the engine running, scanning every shadow between the buildings. My neighbor, this retired cop named Frank, who always sits on his balcony smoking cigarettes even in the middle of the night, waved at me and called down, asking if everything was okay. I must have looked pretty shaken, because he actually came downstairs in his bathrobe and slippers to check on me. When I told him what happened, his whole demeanor changed, and he said there'd been similar reports along that stretch of highway for the past few weeks. Always late at night, always with the same pattern of someone flagging down cars while others waited nearby. The call from the police came about an hour later, after I'd finally made it inside and was sitting on my couch still wearing my scrubs, clutching a cup of coffee with both hands. The officer on the phone introduced himself as Sergeant Brennan and said they'd found something disturbing at the location I'd described. There were fresh tire marks that matched my vehicle's tread pattern where I'd accelerated away, which proved I'd actually stopped there. But here's what made my whole body go numb with fear. They also found a burned-out sedan about 50 yards further down the shoulder, hidden behind a cluster of trees. The car had been reported stolen from a mall parking lot 3 days earlier, and inside they found personal items suggesting someone had been living in it, including maps of the highway system, with certain spots circled in red marker, my exit being one of them. Sergeant Brennan asked me to come to the station the next morning to look at some security footage they'd pulled from a traffic camera about a mile before where I'd stopped. When I got there, still exhausted but too wired to sleep anyway, they showed me grainy black and white video from earlier that same night. Around midnight, 2 hours before my encounter, the camera captured what looked like 3 people dragging something heavy from a van into the woods near that exact spot. The van didn't have plates, and the image quality was too poor to make out faces, but you could see them making multiple trips back and forth. Then, about 30 minutes before I drove through, the camera caught them positioning themselves along the shoulder, with one person standing in the spot where I'd seen the waving figure, while the other 2 crouched behind the guardrail exactly where I'd seen them emerge. What really disturbed me, though, was what Sergeant Brennan told me next, while we sat in that sterile interview room with fluorescent lights humming overhead. They'd been tracking a group they suspected of running a sophisticated carjacking ring that targeted solo drivers on isolated stretches of highway. The burned car wasn't their vehicle. It belonged to a woman named Jennifer Huang who'd been reported missing 5 days earlier after leaving her night shift at a warehouse 40 miles north. Her credit cards had been used at various gas stations heading south, always late at night, always just one transaction before moving on. The police theorized that the group would use stolen vehicles until they burned them out, literally, to destroy evidence, then move on to acquiring a new one from whoever stopped to help their supposedly stranded member. The detective working the case, a woman named Carla Donovan with tired eyes and coffee stains on her sleeve, showed me Jennifer's photo from her missing person report. She looked about my age, wearing scrubs in the picture because she'd been a nurse too, working nights at a regional medical center. That detail hit me harder than anything else, knowing that we'd probably driven that same stretch of highway hundreds of times, both exhausted after long shifts, both alone in the dark. Detective Donovan said they suspected I wasn't the first person to escape this trap. There'd been 2 other reports in the past month of drivers who'd had similar encounters, but managed to speed away. The difference was that neither of them had called it in immediately like I did, and by the time they reported it days later, there was no evidence left to investigate. They kept me at the station for 3 more hours, going through every detail multiple times, having me mark on a map exactly where I'd seen each figure and which direction they'd moved. The forensics team had found footprints in the gravel that suggested at least 4 people had been present, not just the 3 I'd seen, which meant someone else had been watching from somewhere I hadn't even noticed. Detective Donovan mentioned that they'd also discovered a pattern in the timing. All the encounters happened on weeknights between midnight and 4 in the morning, when traffic was lightest and emergency response times were longest. She gave me her direct number and told me to call immediately if I remembered anything else, or if I noticed anyone following me, because sometimes these groups would fixate on the ones who got away. For the next 2 weeks, I completely changed my routine, taking different routes home, varying my schedule whenever possible, and always leaving the hospital with at least one other person walking to the parking garage. Frank, my neighbor, started checking on me every night when I got home, and I'd text Detective Donovan each time I arrived safely, which probably seemed excessive but gave me some peace of mind. Then, on a Monday afternoon, I got the call that they'd made arrests after pulling over a van on that same stretch of highway for a broken taillight. Inside were 4 people, including a woman who matched the description of the figure who'd been waving that night, along with rope, zip ties, and 3 different stolen license plates. They found Jennifer Huang's hospital ID badge hidden under the spare tire, along with personal items from at least 6 other missing persons cases spanning 3 states. The trial won't start for another few months, but Detective Donovan says my testimony will be crucial since I'm the only witness who called immediately and provided real-time evidence of their method. Jennifer Huang is still missing, along with 2 other victims they've connected to this group. And honestly, that's what haunts me most about this whole experience. I still work nights at the hospital because bills don't stop just because you're scared. But I take the city streets now instead of the highway, adding an extra 20 minutes to my commute. Sometimes when I'm driving home and see someone on the side of the road, even in broad daylight, my chest gets tight and I have to remind myself to breathe. The thing that really stays with me, though, is knowing that if I'd stopped just a few seconds longer, if I'd actually gotten out to help like my instincts first told me to, I would have been another missing person case, another burned out car on the shoulder, another nurse who never made it home from her shift. At 31, I'd been driving cross-country routes for my job as a medical equipment sales rep for almost 6 years, and I'd never had anything worse happen than a flat tire in broad daylight. That night in early September 2022 changed everything about how I travel now. I'd just finished a late presentation at a hospital in Des Moines and was heading to my next appointment in Kansas City, figuring I'd drive through the night and grab a motel room when I got there around 4 in the morning. My silver Toyota Camry had been acting up lately, making this weird grinding noise whenever I turned left too sharply, but my mechanic buddy told me it was probably just the power steering fluid getting low. Nothing urgent. I'd been meaning to get it checked properly, but between back-to-back sales trips and my recent divorce proceedings with Brian, I kept pushing it off. The highway stretched out empty ahead of me, one of those long rural stretches where the nearest town is 40 miles in either direction, just cornfields and darkness on both sides. The temperature gauge started creeping up around midnight, right when I was passing through the absolute middle of nowhere on Highway 169. First, it just nudged past the center mark, which happens sometimes on long drives, but within 5 minutes it was climbing toward the red zone, and I could smell that distinct burnt sweet odor of overheating coolant. I pulled over onto the shoulder, my hazard lights clicking in rhythm with my quickening heartbeat, and killed the engine before any serious damage could happen. Steam started hissing out from under the hood almost immediately, creating these ghostly white wisps in my headlight beams that dissipated into the darkness. The silence hit me like a physical weight once the engine stopped ticking and pinging as it cooled down. No cricket sounds, no wind through the corn, just absolute stillness broken only by the metallic cooling sounds of my engine. I checked my phone and of course 0 bars, not even emergency service, which seemed impossible. But there it was, that dreaded no service message mocking me from the screen. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, door locked, windows cracked just enough to keep the interior from fogging up, scrolling through useless offline apps on my phone just to have something to do with my nervous energy. Every few minutes I'd pop the hood release and walk around to check if the steam had stopped, but the engine was still way too hot to even think about removing the radiator cap. The owner's manual in my glove compartment said to wait at least 30 minutes before attempting anything, and even then, only if you had coolant or water to add. Which of course I didn't, because why would I ever think to keep emergency supplies in my car like a responsible adult? That stretch of 169 was notorious for being empty at night, mostly used by truckers during daylight hours, and locals who knew better than to drive it after dark. I'd passed maybe 3 vehicles in the last hour before breaking down, and that was during the relatively busy midnight hour. Now, approaching 1 in the morning, the chances of seeing another car were getting slimmer by the minute. The first hint of hope came as a faint glow on the horizon behind me, barely visible in my side mirror, just a slight brightening of the darkness that meant headlights were coming from several miles away. I actually said thank God out loud to myself and started rehearsing what I'd say to whoever stopped, already planning to offer them $50, just to follow me to the nearest gas station once my car cooled down enough to limp there. The lights grew steadily brighter, taking forever to close the distance, which made sense given how flat and straight the highway was in that area. As they got closer, I could make out that it was something big, definitely not a regular car, maybe a pickup truck or an SUV based on how high and widely spaced the headlights were. I turned on my phone's flashlight and got out of the car, standing by my open driver's door and getting ready to wave them down, figuring nobody could miss a woman standing next to a car with hazards going on an otherwise empty highway. The vehicle started slowing down about a quarter-mile away, which gave me this huge wave of relief, because for a second there, I thought they might just blow past me like I wasn't even there. But then it kept slowing down, way more than necessary, crawling forward at maybe 5 miles per hour for the last 100 yards or so. The headlights were blinding me directly now, making it impossible to see anything about the vehicle itself except that it was definitely a van, one of those tall commercial types, maybe white or light gray from what I could glimpse around the light glare. It finally came to a complete stop directly across from me in the opposite lane, engine running rough and loud, like it needed a new muffler, or maybe had some kind of modification to make it sound more aggressive. The headlights stayed on full brightness, pointed right at me and my car, and I had to shield my eyes with my hand while waiting for someone to roll down a window or open a door. But nothing happened. The van just sat there maybe 15 feet away, engine rumbling in this deep, irregular rhythm that seemed to vibrate through the empty highway and into my chest. 30 seconds passed, then a minute, and still no movement from the van, no dimming of the lights, no window rolling down, nothing. I couldn't see through the windshield at all because of how the headlights were angled and how they were reflecting off my car's windows and chrome, creating this wall of harsh white light between us. I waved my phone flashlight in a friendly greeting motion and called out, "Hey, thanks for stopping," but my voice sounded thin and weak against the rumbling engine noise. When there was still no response, I took a few steps forward, thinking maybe they couldn't hear me, but then stopped myself because something about the whole situation was starting to feel wrong in a way I couldn't quite define. The logical part of my brain was saying they were probably just being cautious, maybe an older person who was scared to get out and help a stranger at night, or possibly someone on the phone trying to call for help on my behalf. But the primitive part of my brain, that ancient survival instinct we all have, was screaming at me to get back in my car right now. I slowly backed toward my Camry, keeping my eyes on the van even though I couldn't see anything useful through the light glare, and slid back into the driver's seat without turning my back on the other vehicle. My fingers found the door lock button and I pressed it, hearing all 4 locks engage with a solid thunk that made me feel marginally safer, even though I knew how useless those locks would be if someone really wanted to get in. The van's engine note changed slightly, revving up a bit like someone was pressing the gas pedal while in park, and then I saw something that made my whole body go rigid with fear. The driver's door was opening, just a crack at first, maybe 2 or 3 inches, but enough for me to see that the interior dome light had been removed or disabled because no light came on inside. The door stayed open like that for at least 10 seconds, just barely ajar, and I could swear I saw movement in that dark gap, like someone was watching me through the opening. Then, just as suddenly as it had opened, the door pulled shut with a solid thump that I could hear even over the engine noise. My car key was already in my hand, and I shoved it into the ignition, turning it even though I knew the engine was still too hot and probably wouldn't start without causing serious damage. The starter motor whined in protest and the engine tried to turn over but couldn't quite catch, just making these horrible grinding sounds that I knew meant expensive repairs, even if I got out of this situation. The temperature gauge was still showing way too high, but I didn't care anymore because that van door opening had changed everything about what this was. I tried starting it again, pumping the gas pedal like that would somehow help, and this time the engine caught for maybe 2 seconds before dying with a shudder that shook the whole car. Through all of this, the van hadn't moved an inch, just sat there with its headlights burning into my retinas. But now I noticed something else that made my situation even worse. There was another set of headlights in my rearview mirror, coming up from behind me, moving slowly just like the van had done. This second vehicle, another large one from what I could tell, crept up and stopped about the same distance behind me as the van was in front, boxing me in completely on this narrow shoulder. Its headlights were on high beam too, filling my car with light from both directions, making me feel like I was on a stage under spotlights. I grabbed my phone again, desperately trying to get any signal, even just one bar to make an emergency call, but still nothing. I was holding it up toward the window, moving it around, trying to catch any possible signal, when I heard car doors opening, not slamming shut but opening from both vehicles at the same time. Through the blinding light I could barely make out shapes, 2 figures from the van in front and at least one from whatever was behind me, all moving slowly and deliberately, not rushing but not hesitating either. They were staying just outside the direct beams of their own headlights, keeping to the shadows at the edges, where I could only see silhouettes and suggestions of movement. One of them walked up to my passenger side window and just stood there, close enough that I could see they were wearing dark clothes, maybe jeans and a jacket, but their face was completely hidden in shadow above my window line. They didn't knock, didn't try the handle, just stood perfectly still like they were waiting for something. Another figure appeared at my driver's side, same distance away, same completely motionless stance, and I realized they were positioned so I couldn't open either door without hitting them. The third one, and now I could see there was definitely a fourth one too, circled around to the front and back of my car. I was completely surrounded, and they were all just standing there in absolute silence, not making any demands, not trying to communicate, just waiting. The only sound was the 2 engines idling, and my own ragged breathing that was fogging up the windows despite my efforts to control it. I had my phone ready to use as a weapon if needed, which sounds ridiculous now, but at the time it was literally the only thing I had besides my car keys. Then one of them, the one by my passenger window, lifted their hand and tapped on the glass with one knuckle. Just twice. Soft and almost polite. When I didn't respond, staying frozen in my seat with my fingers white-knuckled around my phone, they tapped again. Same pattern, same weird gentleness. The figure on my driver's side did the exact same thing at the exact same moment. 2 soft taps in perfect synchronization, like they had rehearsed it. That's when I knew this wasn't random, wasn't just some group of criminals who happened upon a broken-down car. This was planned, coordinated, and they had probably done this before. My mind started racing through every option, ramming the van in front even with an overheating engine, trying to drive through the cornfield, screaming even though nobody would hear me, anything to break out of this trap. But before I could act on any of these desperate ideas, all 4 of them stepped back at the same time. Just one step, still maintaining their positions but giving me just enough space that I could theoretically open a door. The one in front raised their hand and made a rolling motion, like they were telling me to start my car and leave. I didn't need to be told twice and turned the key again, begging the universe to let my car start just this once, promising I'd never skip maintenance again, never ignore warning sounds, never drive alone at night through empty highways. The engine turned over once, twice, and then miraculously caught and held, running rough and making terrible sounds but actually running. The temperature gauge immediately shot to the red zone, but I shifted into drive anyway, ready to destroy the engine if it meant getting away from these people. But when I pressed the gas pedal, the car lurched forward maybe 3 feet and then died completely, all the dashboard lights going dark, even the hazard lights clicking off into nothing. The electrical system was completely dead, and this time I knew it wasn't coming back. The 2 vehicles that had trapped me suddenly killed their headlights too, plunging everything into absolute darkness. And for a moment I couldn't see anything at all, couldn't hear anything except my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My phone screen was the only light source now, casting this weak blue glow inside my car, and I held it up trying to see what was happening outside. The 4 figures were gone, or at least I couldn't see them anymore. And for maybe 30 seconds nothing moved. Nothing happened. Just me sitting in my dead car in pitch blackness on an empty highway. Then both vehicles started up again simultaneously, their engines roaring to life but still no lights. Oh. I heard them pulling away, one forward and one backward, their tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. And within seconds, they were accelerating away in opposite directions, driving completely dark on the highway. I sat there shaking, unable to process what had just happened. Still expecting them to come back, still waiting for something horrible that never came. It took me another 10 minutes before I could make myself get out of the car and start walking, using my phone's flashlight to navigate the shoulder, constantly checking behind me every few steps. I walked for almost 2 hours before a state trooper found me, and when I told him what happened, he just nodded like he'd heard this before, and said there had been similar reports from that stretch of 169 over the past few months. They never found any evidence of who these people were, and the trooper told me I was lucky because 2 other drivers who'd broken down on that same stretch in the previous year hadn't been found for days, both of them discovered in their locked cars in various states of psychological trauma, unable or unwilling to explain what had happened to them during the missing time between their breakdown and when they were discovered. The investigators think it's some kind of group that targets vulnerable motorists, maybe doing it for intimidation, maybe for something worse that I was lucky enough to avoid by my car dying completely. I had to get therapy to deal with the nightmares, and even now, 2 years later, I can't drive at night anymore without having a panic attack. I take flights whenever possible, or I plan my routes to only drive during daylight hours with plenty of people around. What haunts me most isn't what happened, but what didn't happen, and what might have happened if my car hadn't died completely, or if I'd gotten out when they were standing around me. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there on that stretch of highway, waiting for the next broken down car, executing their strange ritual for reasons I'll never understand. The Peterbilt's engine had been making this weird rattling noise for the past 100 miles. Nothing serious, but enough to keep me on edge during that November 2023 haul. My 39-year-old body already felt like it belonged to someone twice my age. Too many years bouncing around in truck cabs, eating gas station food, sleeping in rest areas. I was moving agricultural equipment from Omaha to Denver, a route that usually took me about 10 hours if everything went smooth. Nancy had packed those beef sandwiches she always makes, the ones with the horseradish spread that burns just right, wrapped tight in aluminum foil. I kept thinking about getting home for my daughter Megan's basketball game on Saturday morning. She'd been practicing her free throws all month, and I'd promised to be there this time. The Nebraska rest stop near mile marker 287 sits about 40 miles west of Grand Island. One of those newer facilities built with federal funding that actually has decent lighting and those vending machines that never eat your dollar bills. I pulled in around 3 in the morning, needing to stretch my legs and grab some coffee to push through the last leg to Denver. The parking lot surprised me. At least 15 cars scattered across the regular vehicle section, way more than you'd expect at this hour. Sedans, SUVs, a couple of minivans, different colors and states on the license plates. Sometimes you hit these random clusters of travelers, maybe all avoiding some weather system or construction zone further up the highway. The truck parking area was nearly empty though, just me and 2 other rigs parked way at the far end, their running lights glowing orange in the darkness. I grabbed my jacket from behind the seat, one of those thick Carhartt ones with the quilted lining that Nancy bought me 2 Christmases ago, and headed toward the main building. The cold hit different that night, sharp and dry, the kind that makes your nose hairs freeze up instantly. As I walked past those parked cars, something started bothering me, like when you're trying to remember if you locked your front door but can't quite recall. Every single vehicle had frost on the windshields, that thin layer you get when cars sit for a while in cold weather. But underneath the frost, the glass looked foggy, like they'd all been running recently with people inside. The parking lot lights made everything look washed out and yellowish, creating these long shadows that stretched between the vehicles like dark fingers reaching across the asphalt. The automatic doors whooshed open, and I stepped into that artificial warmth that always smells like old coffee, and industrial cleaner. The place was dead quiet, except for the electrical hum of the vending machines lined up against the far wall, their lights flickering slightly like they always do in these places. I headed straight for the men's room, my boots echoing on those polished concrete floors they put in all these rest stops now. The bathroom door was propped wide open with one of those yellow wet floor cones, but the floors were bone dry. Inside, all the faucets were dripping in this weird synchronized rhythm, like someone had turned them all on just enough to leak at the exact same rate. The mirrors had condensation on them, foggy patches right about face height, as if a bunch of people had been standing there breathing on the glass not too long ago. I did my business quick, that uneasy feeling crawling up my spine like cold fingers. When I went to wash my hands, the soap dispensers were all empty, every single one of them. But there were fresh soap suds still sliding down the sides of the sinks, pink foam from that cheap industrial soap they use. The paper towel dispensers had been pulled open, brown paper streaming down to the floor in long strips, like someone had yanked them out in a hurry. I dried my hands on my jeans and got out of there. Back in the main area, I noticed the information rack near the entrance. All those tourism brochures for local attractions and hotels had been emptied out, the pamphlets scattered across the floor in a trail leading toward the exit doors. But what really got me was the vending machines. Every single item had been selected, the metal coils all turned to their endpoints, but nothing had dropped down. Bags of chips, candy bars, bottles of soda, all hanging there at impossible angles, defying gravity. Something made me walk over to the windows facing the parking lot. Maybe just to confirm what my brain was already screaming at me to acknowledge. Those 15 cars sat there under the yellow lights, and now I could see inside them better. Every single driver's seat was pushed all the way back, like whoever had been driving was either really tall or had needed to get out in a hurry without taking time to adjust anything. The doors, I hadn't noticed it walking in, but now I could see. They were all slightly ajar, not wide open, just cracked maybe an inch or two, interior dome lights off despite the doors being open. That's when I saw the keys. Every single vehicle had its keys still in the ignition, glinting under the parking lot lights. Some of them had those heavy keychains people use, rabbit's feet and bottle openers and little photos in plastic frames, all just dangling there. My mouth went dry and I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears like a drum. I backed away from the window and started moving toward the exit, trying to look casual even though nobody was around to see me. The coffee could wait. Hell, everything could wait. I just needed to get back to my truck and get out of there. But as I pushed through those automatic doors, the cold air hit me along with something else. A smell like burning rubber mixed with something sweet. Almost like caramel, but wrong somehow. Synthetic. The parking lot seemed darker now, even though nothing had changed, and I could hear this low humming sound, barely audible, like 100 people humming the same note just below the range of normal hearing. My boots crunched on something as I walked. Broken pieces of cell phones, dozens of them, scattered across the asphalt like someone had taken a hammer to a phone store display. I picked up my pace, almost jogging now toward my Peterbilt, fumbling for my keys with numb fingers. The two other trucks I'd seen earlier were still there, but now I noticed their doors were open too, cabs dark, no sign of the drivers. As I passed that cluster of abandoned cars, I could see more details that made my gut clench. Purses left on passenger seats, coffee cups still steaming in cup holders, a baby's car seat with the straps undone and hanging loose. One minivan had a DVD player still running in the back, some cartoon playing on repeat, the glow from the screen casting blue shadows through the frosted windows. The Nebraska license plates, Iowa, Colorado, Wyoming, all different places, but every single car had the same thing, a parking receipt from this rest stop tucked under the windshield wiper, all time stamped within the last hour. How the hell do 15 different groups of people all disappear within an hour? I reached my truck and grabbed the door handle, ready to climb up into safety, when I heard it, the distinct sound of car engines turning over, one after another, like dominoes falling. But nobody was starting them. I turned around slowly. my breath coming out in quick white puffs in the cold air, and watched as every single abandoned car in that parking lot came to life. Not roaring to life, just idling, that low purr of engines warming up. The headlights stayed off though, and the cars just sat there running in the dark like they were waiting for something. Then I noticed the steam starting to rise from their exhaust pipes, thick white clouds in the freezing air, but the smoke wasn't drifting away like it should. It was moving sideways, creeping along the ground toward my truck like morning fog. Except fog doesn't move with purpose, doesn't seem to reach for you. That's when the radios turned on. Every car radio, all at once, but not playing music or talk shows. It was voices, dozens of different voices all talking at the same time but not to each other, like recorded conversations played simultaneously. I could make out fragments as I stood there paralyzed. Someone ordering lunch, a woman singing happy birthday, a man arguing about a football game, a child asking to stop for the bathroom. Normal conversations, everyday stuff, but all cut up and overlapping in this horrible cacophony that made my teeth ache. The smell got stronger, that burnt rubber and fake sweet combination that made me want to gag. And underneath all those voices from the radios, I could hear something else. Breathing. Synchronized breathing, like when you're in a quiet room and suddenly become aware of your own breath. Except this was coming from inside those empty cars, from seats that I could clearly see had nobody in them. My hands finally found the truck door handle, and I yanked myself up into the cab, slamming the door behind me hard enough to rattle the whole vehicle. My fingers fumbled with the keys, missing the ignition twice before finally getting them in. The Peterbilt roared to life, that familiar diesel rumble that usually comforted me now sounding too loud, too obvious. Through my windshield, I watched as every single headlight in that parking lot flicked on at the exact same moment. All of them pointed directly at my truck. Not just the front headlights, the brake lights, the reverse lights, the fog lights. Every possible light on those vehicles blazed to life, bathing my cab in this harsh, blinding white and red glow that made shadows dance across my dashboard like living things. The voices on the radios got louder, more frantic, overlapping into this wall of human sound that penetrated right through my closed windows. And then, just as I slammed the truck into gear, I saw them in my side mirrors, people standing behind each car, perfectly still, all facing my truck. But when I turned to look directly, nothing. Check the mirror again. They were there. Look back. Empty parking lot. I gunned it out of there, probably taking that exit turn faster than any 18-wheeler should. Tires screaming against the asphalt. In my rearview mirror, those lights followed me, not the cars, just the lights, staying at the exact same distance no matter how hard I pushed the accelerator. They stayed with me for maybe 5 miles down Interstate 80 before suddenly cutting out all at once, leaving me in complete darkness, except for my own headlights cutting through the Nebraska night. I didn't stop driving until I hit Denver. Didn't even pull over to check that rattling sound in the engine that had gotten worse during my escape. When I finally got to the delivery point and told my dispatcher about what happened, he laughed and said, I must have dozed off and had a nightmare, but I know what I saw. I know those people in the mirrors were real. And I know that 3 days later, when I looked up news for that area, there were reports of 17 vehicles found abandoned at that same rest stop, all with their engines running, keys in the ignition, and no sign of the drivers or passengers. The reports said it was probably human trafficking or some coordinated crime, but they never found anyone, never found any bodies, never found any explanation. I never took that route again. Told my dispatcher I'd quit before driving through Nebraska after dark, and I meant it. Nancy thinks I had some kind of breakdown, maybe a panic attack from too many hours on the road. And I let her believe that because it's easier than trying to explain what really happened. But sometimes, when I'm driving at night on any empty highway, I'll catch a glimpse of headlights in my mirror that seem to be following at the exact same distance for too long, and I have to pull over at the next truck stop, wait it out with other drivers around, pretending to check my logs or grab coffee until the feeling passes. I still drive for a living. Bills don't pay themselves. But I plan my routes different now, always making sure I'm near populated areas when 3 in the morning rolls around. And I never, ever stop at rest areas when there are too many cars, but no people. That's the thing that still keeps me up some nights, turning it over in my mind like a puzzle with missing pieces. Where did all those people go? What were those things I saw standing behind the cars that only existed in reflections? About a month ago, another trucker named Glenn told me something at a Flying J outside Denver that made my blood turn to ice water. He said his cousin drives that same stretch of Interstate 80, and one night around 3 in the morning, he saw a bunch of abandoned trucks at that same rest stop. Big rigs like mine, doors open, engines running, nobody around. But here's the thing that really got me. Glenn's cousin said he saw someone in his mirror walking between the trucks, checking each cab like they were looking for something specific. When he turned to look directly, the parking lot was empty. But in the mirror, clear as day, the figure kept searching, kept moving from truck to truck with this methodical patience that made him floor it out of there without looking back. We compared dates. It was exactly 1 month after my experience, down to the day. Glenn's cousin won't drive that route anymore either. Makes you wonder how many of us have seen things at that rest stop, how many have kept quiet because nobody would believe us anyway. All I know is that place isn't right. And whatever's happening there, it's still happening. Still hunting, still collecting. My headlights caught her in that strange way where everything else disappears into darkness. She was standing on the shoulder of Route 47, both arms raised high above her head, waving in these big, sweeping motions like she was trying to flag down a plane instead of a car. The dashboard clock showed 3:17 a.m., and I'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes since leaving the hospital parking garage, my scrubs still smelling like disinfectant, and that weird metallic scent that clings to you after 12 hours in the respiratory unit. Being 29 means you think you're invincible, that nothing bad can happen to you, especially when you've dealt with life and death situations all night. But seeing this woman out there, completely alone on this stretch of highway that runs through nothing but abandoned warehouses and overgrown fields, made something in my chest tighten up. I remember gripping the steering wheel harder, my knuckles going white while I debated what to do. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to keep driving, to call 911 once I got further down the road, let someone else deal with it. But she looked so desperate, and I kept thinking about my sister Katie, how she'd broken down on a similar road last year, and nobody stopped for 3 hours. The woman was wearing dark clothes, a navy blazer that looked expensive even from a distance, nice jeans, not the kind of outfit you'd expect from someone dangerous. Her blonde hair was shoulder length, neat despite the wind from passing semis, so I did what I probably shouldn't have done. I slowed down, checked my mirrors for any other cars lurking nearby, and pulled over about 50 feet ahead of her, keeping my engine running and my phone in my lap with 911 already dialed but not yet called. She jogged up to my passenger window, and I only rolled it down about 3 inches, just enough to hear her speak. Up close, she was maybe 45, with one of those faces that probably looked younger in better lighting. Her makeup was perfect though, which struck me as odd for someone stranded at 3 in the morning. No smeared mascara from crying, no signs of distress on her face at all. She smiled at me, this calm, almost serene expression that didn't match the frantic waving from moments before. "Thank you so much for stopping," she said, her voice steady and pleasant, like we were meeting at a coffee shop instead of on a dark highway. My car broke down about a mile back, and my phone died. I just need a ride to the next exit where I can call someone. Her explanation made sense, but something about her demeanor set off every alarm bell in my head. Still, I unlocked the door. God knows why. Maybe because turning away someone who looked so normal, so put together, felt cruel. She slid into the passenger seat with this fluid grace, closing the door gently behind her, and immediately the car filled with her perfume, something floral and heavy that reminded me of funeral homes. I pulled back onto the highway, accelerating slowly while trying to make conversation to ease my nerves. Asked her what happened to her car, and she said something vague about the engine making weird noises before it just stopped. Asked where she was headed before breaking down, and she said she was visiting family but didn't specify where. Every answer was like that, polite, reasonable on the surface, but completely empty of any real information. The next exit was only about 10 miles away, but those were going to be the longest 10 miles of my life. I kept glancing at her in my peripheral vision, and she just sat there, hands folded neatly in her lap, staring straight ahead through the windshield with that same subtle smile playing at the corners of her mouth. About 5 minutes into the drive, I reached over to adjust my rearview mirror because a semi was coming up behind us with its high beams on. That's when I noticed it. The side mirror on the passenger side showed the empty seat, just the beige fabric of my car's interior, the seatbelt hanging loose, nothing else. But she was right there. I could see her in my peripheral vision, could smell that overwhelming perfume, could hear her breathing in this measured, deliberate way. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the angle, maybe the darkness was playing tricks, maybe I was more exhausted than I thought. I adjusted the mirror slightly, tilted my head different ways, but no matter what I did, the reflection showed an empty seat. My heart started hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears, this thick, wet pounding that made it hard to focus on the road. "Is everything all right?" she asked, and her voice sounded different now, lower, with this weird echo quality like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and forced myself to look straight ahead, told her everything was fine, just tired from my shift. She made this humming sound, not quite agreement, not quite anything really, just this low vibration that seemed to fill the entire car. The temperature dropped suddenly, or maybe that was just me going cold with fear, but I could see my breath coming out in little puffs even though it was August, and the AC wasn't even on that high. I started doing the math in my head. 5 more miles to the exit, maybe 6 minutes if I sped up a little. But when I pressed harder on the gas pedal, the speedometer didn't budge. We were still going exactly 55, no matter how hard I pressed down. That's when she started talking, not to me exactly, but just talking in this monotone voice about the strangest things. "People leave pieces of themselves everywhere they go," she said, her head still facing forward, never turning to look at me. "In their cars, in their homes, in the places they work. Little fragments of who they are, what they've done, what they're going to do. Sometimes those pieces get picked up by others. Sometimes they get carried forward. I had no idea how to respond to that, so I just kept driving, watching the mile markers pass by with agonizing slowness." She continued, "You left something at the hospital tonight. Not equipment, not belongings, something else. And now you're carrying something that isn't yours." My mouth went completely dry. I wanted to ask her what she meant, wanted to scream at her to get out of my car, but my voice wouldn't work. It was like my throat had sealed itself shut. The exit sign finally came into view. Exit 42, with a gas station logo and a promise of food and lodging. Relief washed over me so intensely that I almost sobbed. I put on my turn signal, started to ease into the exit lane, and that's when she placed her hand on the dashboard. Not on my arm, not reaching for the wheel, just flat against the dashboard. Her hand was wrong. The fingers were too long, bent at angles that shouldn't have been possible, and the skin had this translucent quality where I could see dark veins pulsing underneath. "Not this exit," she said calmly. "The next one." But there was no next exit for another 15 miles. I knew this highway like the back of my hand, had driven it hundreds of times. My foot moved to the brake anyway, started to slow down for the exit, and she made this clicking sound with her tongue, sharp and disapproving like you'd make at a misbehaving dog. I jerked the wheel hard to the right, tires screaming as I veered into the exit lane despite her protests. The moment I did, she went completely silent. Not just quiet. It was like all sound in the car had been sucked out, creating this vacuum that made my ears pop painfully. I risked a glance at the passenger seat and found it empty. Completely. Absolutely empty. The seatbelt was still buckled somehow, stretched across nothing, and that overwhelming perfume smell had vanished instantly. But the passenger door was hanging wide open, swinging back and forth even though we were moving at 40 miles an hour. The interior light was on, illuminating the seat, and there was something lying there. A phone. At first I thought she'd left her phone behind, but as I pulled into the gas station parking lot with shaking legs, I realized it looked exactly like mine. Same case, same cracked corner from when I dropped it last month. Same hospital parking sticker on the back. I slammed on the brakes under the bright canopy lights of the gas station, my real phone still in the cup holder where I'd left it. But this other phone, this duplicate, was lit up and active. The screen showed my GPS app tracking my exact location in real time, following the little blue dot that represented my car. The location history showed everywhere I'd been that night. The hospital, the route I'd taken, even the spot where I'd picked her up. But there were other locations too, places I'd never been, timestamps for the future, for later today, tomorrow, next week. Places called Riverside Memorial Gardens, Bennett Funeral Home, plots with numbers instead of names. My throat constricted as I picked up the phone with trembling fingers, and that's when I saw the last destination programmed into it, set for 4:47 a.m., just 20 minutes from now. It was my apartment address, but the label on it simply said, "Collection Point." I threw both phones onto the passenger floor and ran into the gas station, practically colliding with the glass doors in my panic. The teenager behind the counter looked up from his phone, startled by this woman in wrinkled scrubs bursting in like a maniac. I must have looked insane, trying to explain that someone had been in my car but wasn't really there, that she'd left a phone that was mine but wasn't mine. He just stared at me, suggested maybe I should call the police, which I did. 2 officers showed up about 10 minutes later, probably expecting to deal with a psychiatric case or someone high on something. They checked my car, found the duplicate phone right where I'd thrown it, and their expressions changed immediately. Turns out, they'd been getting similar reports all week. Women picking up other women on various highways around the state, always late at night, always with the same story about a broken-down car. The passengers would vanish, leaving behind these duplicate phones with disturbing GPS data. 3 of the women who'd reported it had died within days. Sudden brain aneurysms, unexplained organ failure, things that shouldn't happen to healthy people in their 20s and 30s. The officers took the duplicate phone as evidence and followed me home, insisted on checking my apartment before I went in. Everything looked normal, nothing out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. I called in sick for the next week, stayed with my sister Katie in another state, trying to make sense of what happened. The duplicate phone was never explained. The police said the GPS data was impossible, that the phone shouldn't have been able to predict future locations like that. They never found any woman matching the description I gave, no abandoned cars on that stretch of highway. 6 days later, I got a call from the police. Another woman had picked up the same passenger, or something that looked like her, on a completely different highway 3 states away. That woman didn't make it to the gas station. They found her car on the side of the road, engine still running, both doors open. 2 phones in the front seat showing the same impossible GPS data. She was in the driver's seat, unconscious but alive, and when she woke up in the hospital, she had no memory of the last 3 years of her life. Just gone, like they'd been deleted. I still work at the hospital, still drive home late at night, but I never stop for anyone anymore. And sometimes, when I'm checking my GPS, I see locations I've never been to flash across the screen for just a second before disappearing. Places I hope I'll never have to visit, at least not while I'm still breathing. "5 months ago, turning 36 had made me realize my life consisted of endless miles of asphalt and the hum of 18 wheels against pavement. Trucking paid the bills, kept me moving from state to state, hauling everything from furniture to frozen goods. That particular week in early May, had me driving a load of electronics from Phoenix to Chicago, a route that usually took me through some pretty desolate stretches of highway. My marriage had fallen apart 6 months prior, and honestly, the solitude of the road felt like exactly what I needed. The cab of my Peterbilt had become more of a home than my actual apartment back in Tucson. That night, the one that still makes me check my mirrors more than necessary, started like any other long haul through the desert. The fuel gauge had been hovering near empty for the last 20 miles, and finding a station open at 2 in the morning on Highway 89 wasn't exactly easy. When the faded Shell sign finally appeared through the darkness, glowing like a beacon against the black desert sky, relief washed over me. The place looked ancient, one of those stations that probably hadn't been renovated since the 70s, with just 2 pumps and a small convenience store attached. No other vehicles sat in the lot, which wasn't unusual for that hour and location. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, casting an uneven glow across the cracked concrete. I pulled the rig in carefully, mindful of the tight space, and killed the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant hum of the store's ancient air conditioning unit, struggling against the desert heat. I grabbed my wallet from the center console and climbed down from the cab, my joints protesting after 4 hours of straight driving. The desert air hit me immediately, still warm despite the early hour, carrying that distinctive smell of creosote and dust. My boots crunched against loose gravel as I walked to the pump, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Through the store window, I could make out the silhouette of someone behind the counter, barely visible through the grime-covered glass. The pump itself looked older than me, one of those analog models where you could actually hear the fuel rushing through the hose. I started filling up, leaning against the truck while the numbers slowly climbed on the display. 40 gallons, 50, 60. Big rigs drink fuel like nothing else, and this would probably cost me close to $300. Inside the store, the clerk hadn't moved once since I'd arrived. Even from outside, I could tell something was wrong with his posture, the way he stood rigid behind that counter, his head slightly tilted like he was listening for something. The fluorescent light above him kept cutting out for split seconds, making him appear and disappear like frames missing from an old film reel. When the pump finally clicked off at 78 gallons, I hung up the nozzle and headed toward the door. The closer I got, the more details I could make out through the window. Young guy, maybe early 20s, wearing a faded red Shell uniform that hung loose on his thin frame. His face was pale, almost gray under those harsh lights, and his eyes kept darting to the door, then back to the counter, then to the door again. The bell above the entrance gave a weak chime as I pushed inside, and the kid practically jumped out of his skin. "Just the diesel," I said, trying to keep my voice casual despite the weird vibe in the place. The store smelled like old coffee and something else, something metallic that reminded me of blood, but could have been rusty pipes. The kid nodded quickly, his fingers trembling as he punched numbers into the ancient register. His name tag read Aaron in faded letters, and up close I could see dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. Behind him, a security monitor showed grainy footage of the parking lot, but the screen kept jumping and distorting, making it impossible to see anything clearly. $312.47, Aaron whispered, his voice barely audible. His eyes flicked to the door again, then to me, then back to the door. I handed him my credit card, and when our fingers brushed during the exchange, his skin felt ice cold despite the warmth of the night. While he ran the card, I noticed his other hand gripping the edge of the counter so hard his knuckles had turned white. The receipt printer screeched to life, making him flinch violently. Every sound seemed to terrify him. The hum of the refrigerators, the buzz of the lights, even his own breathing, which came in short, shallow gasps. "You traveling alone?" he asked suddenly, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. Before I could answer, he leaned forward slightly, glancing toward the door again. "Don't matter, just, when you leave, drive fast. Don't stop for nothing." He pushed the receipt across the counter with shaking fingers. I was about to ask what he meant when he grabbed my wrist. His grip was desperate, urgent. "And don't open that door again," he whispered, his voice cracking. Once you're out, just go, please." The intensity in his eyes made my chest tighten. This wasn't some joke or local trying to mess with an outsider. I pulled my hand back, pocketed the receipt, and headed for the door without another word. Whatever was happening here, the kid's fear was real enough to make me want to get back on the road immediately. The bell chimed again as I pushed outside, and I heard Aaron let out a sound behind me, something between a whimper and a prayer. The walk back to my truck felt longer than before, the darkness beyond the station's lights seeming to press in from all sides. I climbed up into the cab quickly, locked the doors, and started the engine. The diesel rumbled to life, a comforting sound after the strangeness inside that store. I was just putting the truck in gear when I heard it. A soft knocking on the glass of the passenger door. 3 deliberate taps, patient and measured. My head snapped toward the sound, but the parking lot lights didn't reach that side of the cab. All I could see in the window was blackness. Then a voice, clear despite the running engine, came from outside the passenger door. "Come on, Richard, open up. We need to talk." My entire body went rigid. Richard. That voice had just said my name. My actual name that I hadn't told anyone at this stop, that wasn't on any paperwork visible in the cab, that the kid inside definitely hadn't used. The credit card I'd paid with was a company card under the trucking firm's name, not mine. My CDL was tucked away in my wallet. There was absolutely no way anyone here could know my name. The knock came again, still gentle, almost friendly. "Richard, I know you can hear me. Just crack the window, 5 minutes, that's all I need." The voice sounded normal, masculine, maybe middle-aged, with no accent I could place. But there was something underneath the words, something that made every instinct scream at me not to look, not to respond, just drive. I slammed the truck into first gear and started rolling forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the side mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure stepping back from the truck, tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark suit. Who wears a suit in the middle of the desert at 2 in the morning? The figure didn't chase after the truck, just stood there watching as I pulled away. "Richard, you're making this harder than it needs to be," the voice called out, somehow still audible over the diesel engine. "I'll be seeing you at the next stop, mile marker 277. You know you have to stop there." My throat went dry. Mile marker 277 was the way station, mandatory for all commercial vehicles. If I skipped it, I'd have Dati on my ass within hours, probably lose my CDL. But how did this person know my route? How did they know I'd have to stop there? I hit the highway doing 70, way over the limit for a loaded rig, but I didn't care. In the rearview mirror, the gas station lights faded into the distance, swallowed by the desert darkness. My phone, mounted on the dashboard, showed 2:23 a.m. The way station was maybe 40 miles ahead, less than an hour at this speed. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see headlights following, but the road remained empty. Just me, the yellow lines, and miles of nothing. Then I noticed something that made my grip tighten on the wheel. The GPS on my phone was showing my name at the top of the screen, Richard's route, something I'd never programmed, never seen before. I reached over to check the settings, and that's when I saw the recent search history wasn't mine. Addresses I'd never looked up. My ex-wife's new apartment in Flagstaff, my mother's nursing home in Albuquerque, my daughter's college dorm at ASU. Places this person, whoever they were, wanted me to know they knew about. The mile markers counted down like a timer on a bomb. 251, 250, 249, each one bringing me closer to that way station where he said he'd be waiting. I tried calling 911, but my phone showed no service despite having full bars just minutes before. The radio in the truck produced only static, no matter which channel I tried. Even the CB, usually full of late-night chatter from other truckers, was dead silent. It felt like I was driving through a bubble, cut off from the rest of the world. At mile marker 265, I made a decision. There was a truck stop at exit 38, a big flying J that would have people, witnesses, maybe even security. I could park there, wait until daylight, figure out what to do. But as I approached the exit, my foot wouldn't move to the brake pedal. I pressed down hard, but nothing happened. The pedal felt normal, had resistance, but the truck kept maintaining exactly 70 miles per hour. The steering wheel turned freely. I could change lanes, but I couldn't slow down, couldn't take the exit. Panic started creeping up my spine as I watched the Flying J pass by in a blur of lights. Whatever was happening, whoever this person was, they had control of my truck somehow. The electronics, the brakes, probably the accelerator too. Modern trucks are all computer-controlled, and someone with the right knowledge could hack into the systems. But doing it while the truck was moving, from a distance? That was something else entirely. Mile marker 277 appeared in my headlights like a tombstone. The weigh station sat just ahead, its inspection lanes empty, the office building dark except for a single light in the front window. As my truck began to slow on its own, finally responding to my desperate pumping of the brakes, I saw him. The same tall figure in the dark suit standing next to a black sedan parked beside the scale house. He raised one hand in a casual wave, like we were old friends meeting for coffee. My truck rolled to a stop exactly where it needed to for the weigh-in, and the engine died without me turning the key. The man walked toward my truck with measured steps, his face becoming clearer under the overhead lights. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, unremarkable features except for his eyes. They were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost white. He stopped at my door and knocked 3 times, the same patient rhythm from before. "Richard, please step out of the vehicle. We have business to discuss regarding your cargo." My cargo? I was hauling electronics, nothing special, just TVs and computers for a Best Buy distribution center. Through the side mirror, I watched him pull out what looked like a small tablet, its screen glowing green in the darkness. "Your manifest says electronics," he continued, his voice carrying perfectly through the closed door. "But we both know there's an extra package in there, serial number X74429. You weren't supposed to know about it, but plans have changed." I had no idea what he was talking about, but something in his tone made me check the sleeper compartment behind my seat. There, wedged between my duffel bag and the back wall, was a metal briefcase I'd never seen before, secured with electronic locks, a small red light blinking steadily on its surface. The man must have seen my expression change because he smiled, a thin stretching of lips that didn't reach those pale eyes. "Previous driver put it there yesterday when you stopped in Phoenix. You've been carrying it for 300 miles without knowing. Now you have 2 choices. Give me the case and drive away, forget this ever happened, go back to your life. Or refuse, and, well," he pulled out a phone, showed me the screen. Security camera footage of my daughter walking into her dorm room, time-stamped from 3 hours ago. "Rebecca's studying for her chemistry midterm right now. Room 314, Preston Hall. She keeps her window cracked because the heater runs too hot." My blood turned to ice. The decision wasn't really a choice at all. With shaking fingers, I reached back, grabbed the briefcase, and climbed down from the cab. The moment my feet hit the pavement, my truck's engine roared back to life on its own, the doors locking automatically. I handed him the case, and he examined it briefly, checking the seals, verifying something on his tablet. "Smart man," he said, already walking back to his sedan. "Your truck will start working normally once I'm gone. And Richard, don't stop at any more gas stations tonight. Take Interstate 40 straight through to Amarillo. Aaron at the Shell station. He won't make it through his shift if you go back." The sedan pulled away, disappearing into the desert darkness, and true to his word, my truck returned to normal. I drove straight through to Chicago, delivered my legitimate cargo, and never said a word about what happened. But I did check the news 3 days later. A young gas station clerk named Aaron Vasquez was found dead at a Shell station on Highway 89. Apparent heart attack, even though he was only 23 years old. That was 5 months ago, and I've since changed routes, only driving daylight hours now. Sometimes I wonder what was in that case, who that man really was, but mostly I'm just grateful my daughter is safe, still calling me every Sunday, still complaining about her dorm room being too hot. The CB radio in my Ford pickup hadn't picked up another driver for hours, just static echoing through Copper Canyon's winding roads. Sandra had called me 2 days earlier about clearing out the rest of my stuff from her place in Utah. Apparently her new boyfriend needed the garage space. Fine by me. I'd been making these furniture runs every few months since the divorce papers were signed, and this Monday night in March was just another trip with another loaded trailer swaying behind my truck. The canyon walls rose up on both sides, ancient rock formations that blocked out most of the sky, except for a narrow strip where clouds covered any trace of moonlight. My supervisor at the warehouse had given me until Wednesday to get back, which meant I could take the old canyon route instead of dealing with the interstate construction zones. 14 hours into the drive, running on nothing but gas station coffee and whatever energy drinks I could find, I kept checking my mirrors to make sure the trailer stayed centered on these sharp curves. A woman's voice suddenly cut through the static on Channel 19, each word coming through clear despite the interference around the edges. "Hello? Can anyone hear me? There's been an accident. We need help. Please, if anyone can hear this, we're just off mile marker 17, about 50 feet down the embankment on the north side. My husband's unconscious and I think his leg is broken. The car rolled twice before it stopped. Please, somebody help us." Something about her tone made my skin prickle. She sounded like she was ordering takeout, not reporting that her car had just tumbled down a mountainside. The calmness in her voice, the way she rattled off those specific details without any panic or tears, it all felt rehearsed somehow. But 40 miles from the nearest town, with these canyon walls blocking any cell signal, you couldn't just drive past someone asking for help. I grabbed the handset while navigating another hairpin turn, knowing mile marker 17 was maybe 3 miles ahead based on the last sign I'd noticed. Against every warning bell going off in my head, I pressed the talk button. "This is eastbound traffic on 19. I hear you loud and clear. I'm about 3 miles out from marker 17. Hang tight, I'm coming to help. Can you tell me what color your car is? Any injuries besides your husband?" My voice echoed back through the speaker for a second before she responded, and when she did, there was this weird delay, like she was thinking about each word before saying it. "Thank you so much for responding. It's a silver sedan, a newer model Toyota. The front end is completely smashed in. I'm okay, just some cuts and bruises, but my husband, he won't wake up. There's blood coming from his head, and his left leg is bent at an angle that doesn't look right. Please hurry." The transmission cut out with a sharp click, and I pushed harder on the accelerator, making the trailer lurch dangerously on the next curve. Something kept nagging at me, though. She never said her name, never mentioned trying to flag down other cars, never asked me to call for an ambulance once I got to somewhere with cell service. Mile marker 16 flew past my window, and I started scanning the shoulder for any sign of an accident scene, my high beams cutting through the darkness ahead. When 17 finally appeared in my headlights, I pulled over as far as I could without risking the trailer sliding off the narrow shoulder, grabbed my flashlight from under the seat, and stepped out into the cold mountain air. The silence hit me immediately. No sound of settling metal, no hiss of a damaged radiator, nothing but the tick of my own engine cooling and the wind whistling through the canyon. I walked along the guardrail, sweeping my flashlight beam down the embankment on the north side, and that's when I saw them. Fresh tire marks on the asphalt, leading straight toward the edge. The guardrail had a decent-sized dent in it, with white paint transfer that looked recent, and when I leaned over to look down, I could see broken glass scattered across the rocks about 20 feet below. But beyond that, nothing. A silver Toyota. No injured passengers, just empty darkness stretching down into the canyon. I spent the next 20 minutes climbing down that embankment, using my flashlight to check every possible spot where a car could have landed. The broken glass formed a trail that led about 50 feet down, exactly where she'd said, but then it just stopped. No skid marks in the dirt, no crushed bushes, no oil stains on the rocks, nothing to indicate a 2-ton vehicle had rolled through here. My boots kept slipping on the loose gravel, and twice I had to grab onto the scraggly pine trees growing out of the cliff face to keep from tumbling down myself. The whole time, I kept thinking about how specific her description had been, how she knew exactly how far down they'd gone. When I finally climbed back up to the road, winded and covered in dirt, I found another driver had stopped behind my truck, an older guy in a Peterbilt who'd seen my hazard lights. "Everything all right, buddy?" he called out, walking toward me with his own flashlight. "Saw your rig parked here and thought you might have trouble with that trailer." I explained about the CB call, the woman asking for help, and he got this look on his face that made my stomach tighten. "Silver Toyota, you said? Young woman, calm voice, husband with a broken leg?" The way he repeated those details, I knew he'd heard the same broadcast. "Got that call about an hour ago when I was heading westbound. Came through clear as day on 19. Thing is, I was talking to my dispatcher right after on a different channel, and he said 3 other drivers had reported the same call tonight, all at different times. Each one stopped to look, and each one found exactly what you found. Evidence of a crash, but no car." He pointed at the tire marks with his light, then at the damaged guardrail. "These marks were here when I passed through this afternoon before sunset. Whatever happened here, it wasn't tonight." We were both standing there trying to make sense of it when the CB radio in my truck crackled to life again. The woman's voice came through the open window, but this time it was different, quieter, more intimate, like she was speaking directly into the microphone. "Thank you for stopping, but you're too late. We've been down here for so long, waiting in the cold. The metal is twisted around us like fingers, and the engine block is pressing against his chest. Can you hear him breathing? Listen carefully." Then came this wet, ragged sound that made both of us step back from the truck. It went on for maybe 10 seconds, irregular and labored before cutting to dead air. The trucker grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in through my jacket. "That ain't coming from no accident scene, friend. I've pulled people from wrecks before and nobody pinned under an engine block sounds like that. We need to get out of here." But then she spoke again, and this time she said something that made every hair on my body stand straight up. "Jerome, I know you're listening. You can't leave us again, Jerome. Not like you did in Utah. Sandra tried to warn you about taking this route, didn't she? She knew what happened here. Check your glove box, Jerome. Check what she packed for you." My legs nearly gave out when I heard my name. Not my handle, not eastbound driver, but my actual name. The trucker was already backing toward his rig, shaking his head and muttering something about not getting paid enough for this. But I couldn't move. Nobody on this road knew my name. I hadn't given it over the radio, hadn't stopped anywhere since crossing the state line. And Sandra, she'd insisted I take some of my old things from the garage, practically forced a box of junk on me that I'd tossed in the passenger seat without looking. My hands trembled as I reached for the truck door, the sound of the Peterbilt's engine roaring to life behind me as the other driver took off without another word. Inside the cab, the dome light seemed too dim, casting shadows that moved wrong across the dashboard. The glove box latch felt cold under my fingers, and when I opened it, a manila envelope fell out onto the floor, one I'd never seen before. Sandra's handwriting was on the front. "Jerome, you need to know the truth about Copper Canyon." Inside were newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, dated from 6 years ago. The headline on the first one read, "Couple missing after canyon crash," with a photo that knocked the breath out of me. It was me, but younger, standing next to a woman I'd never seen before beside a silver Toyota. The article said Jerome Hutchinson and his wife Valerie had disappeared after their car went off the road at mile marker 17. Their bodies never recovered. But that was impossible. 6 years ago, I was living in Colorado, working construction, had never even been to this canyon before meeting Sandra. I grabbed the next clipping with numb fingers. Search called off for missing couple. And there was another photo, this one from a security camera at a gas station. Clear as day, it showed me filling up that same silver Toyota, the timestamp reading 3 days before the accident. The woman from the photo, Valerie, was visible through the passenger window. More clippings, more evidence of a life I'd never lived, a marriage I'd never had, a death that hadn't happened. The last item in the envelope was a note in Sandra's writing. "I found these in your things when we met. You said you didn't remember, that sometimes whole chunks of your past just weren't there. I should have told you sooner, but I was scared. Don't go through that canyon, Jerome. She's still waiting for you there." The CB crackled again, and this time the voice was barely a whisper, close and personal, like lips pressed against the microphone. "Jerome, stop reading those lies. You know who I am. You remember the way my hair smelled like vanilla, the scar on my palm from when I tried to cook you dinner on our anniversary. You remember the song that was playing when we crashed, our song. Turn the radio to FM 93.5. It's playing right now." My finger moved toward the radio dial without conscious thought, like muscle memory taking over, and I had to physically grab my wrist with my other hand to stop myself. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was impossible, that I needed to drive away now, but my hand kept reaching for that dial. When I finally switched it over, static filled the cab for a moment, before a song faded in. Wonderwall by Oasis. The moment those opening chords hit, something cracked inside my skull like ice breaking on a frozen lake, and memories that weren't supposed to exist came flooding through. Valerie laughing in the passenger seat, singing off-key. The argument about her sister, the deer that jumped in front of us, the way the guardrail bent like paper when we hit it, her screaming my name as we went over. The silence after the rolling stopped. But underneath those memories were my other life, meeting Sandra 2 years ago at a bar in Albuquerque, our wedding, the divorce, the warehouse job. 2 complete histories existing in one mind, and I couldn't tell which one was real anymore. The woman on the CB spoke one more time. "I'm still in the car, Jerome. I never left. You did. You crawled out and walked away, and you forgot about me. But every time you drive through here, I try to bring you back. Come down to the car, come back to me. We can leave together this time." I looked down at my hands and saw blood under my fingernails that hadn't been there before, old and dried and flaking off. The newspaper clippings were dissolving in my lap, the ink running like water, forming new words. "You left her to die. You left her to die. You left her to die." I slammed the truck into gear and floored it, the trailer fishtailing wildly as I tore away from mile marker 17. The CB radio kept crackling with her voice, pleading, crying, then angry and screaming my name. But I reached over and ripped the power cord out of the dashboard. The silence that followed was almost worse. In my rearview mirror, I swear I could see headlights rising up from the embankment. Impossible headlights from a car that couldn't exist, following me through every curve. I drove for 3 straight hours without stopping, pushing that old Ford harder than I ever had, until I finally saw the lights of a 24-hour diner near the state line. I pulled in, parked under the brightest light I could find, and sat there until dawn, going through my wallet, my phone, looking for any proof of who I really was. Every photo of Sandra and me was real. My driver's license was real. The divorce papers were real. But so were the scars on my ribs that I'd never noticed before, the ones that looked like they came from a steering wheel impact. I made it home to New Mexico that morning and immediately went to the courthouse to pull public records. Jerome Hutchinson, my name, my social security number, had no death certificate, no missing person report, no record of ever being married to anyone named Valerie. But I found something else in the newspaper archives from 6 years ago. A small article about an unidentified woman's body found in a ravine near Copper Canyon, discovered by hikers months after an apparent car accident. Silver Toyota, partial plate matching what would have been mine if I'd lived in Utah then. She was wearing a wedding ring, but they never found out who she was. The article mentioned that investigators believed there might have been a passenger who walked away from the crash, based on blood evidence found leading up to the road. They never found him. I've never driven through Copper Canyon again, and I won't. I traded in my truck, got rid of the CB radio, moved to a different apartment. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear static that sounds like someone trying to speak. And sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see dried blood under my fingernails that takes forever to wash away. The night had bled into early morning by the time I clocked out from the hospital. My brain was foggy from 12 straight hours of trauma cases, and the only thing I could think about was coffee and a warm shower. The city was still asleep when I started driving home, and for the first few miles, everything felt routine. Then my GPS screen blinked, froze, and restarted with that soft chime I'd heard 1,000 times before. Only this time, it never came back online. I figured I knew the way well enough, but somewhere after the second intersection, I must have turned onto the wrong road. It did not look like any road I had taken before. The asphalt gave way to cracked pavement and then to gravel, flanked by tall weeds that brushed the sides of my car. The sky had started to pale, but there was no hint of dawn warmth, just that dull bluish light that makes everything look abandoned. The radio was dead too. Nothing but static. I kept telling myself it was fine, that I'd hit the highway again soon. But after 20 minutes of driving past nameless turns and sagging mailboxes, I realized I hadn't seen another car at all. When the gas light blinked on, I finally spotted a small gas station just ahead, a single row of pumps, a flickering sign, and a convenience store with the metal shutters halfway down. The lot was empty. I pulled in anyway, parked near the pumps, and stepped out to stretch my legs. The air was colder than I expected, the kind of damp chill that clings to you even through your scrubs. I tried opening my phone's map again, but it showed me floating in a gray void, no roads, no landmarks. That's when I noticed the houses behind the station. They were lined along the opposite side of the road, maybe half a dozen of them, all spaced far apart. Every single one had its lights on. Porch lamps, living room windows, even bedrooms glowing behind drawn curtains. And every front door I could see stood wide open. At first, I thought it was some kind of small-town quirk, maybe early risers or night shift workers like me. But there was no sound, no cars, no dogs, no movement at all. The air felt too still, like the world had paused mid-breath. I stood there for a long minute just staring at those houses. My first instinct was to call out to see if anyone answered back, but something inside me told me not to. I decided to get back into the car and keep driving, figuring the main road had to connect somewhere up ahead. As I pulled out, I glanced again toward the houses, and that was when I realized the street stretched farther than I'd thought. There were more houses beyond the curve, and all of them looked the same. Lights burning, doors hanging open, and absolute silence. The further I went, the worse it got. Every mailbox was empty, no cars in the driveways, not even trash bins by the curb. I started feeling this odd pressure in my chest, like the air itself was heavier the deeper I went into that place. My phone still had no signal, but I could see the battery draining faster than usual. I rolled the window down halfway, hoping to hear some hint of life. Insects, wind, anything. But all I caught was the low hum of my engine echoing between the houses. Eventually, I slowed the car down near an intersection where the road split in 3 directions. On the corner stood a small white house with peeling paint and a swing set in the yard. The swing was moving slightly, not fast, just that slow, steady sway that doesn't stop even when the air is still. I stared at it long enough to notice that the chain made no sound. I thought maybe it was the wind playing tricks, but there was no breeze. I put the car in park again, against my better judgment, and stepped out just to see if someone might be inside. The closer I got to that house, the more wrong everything looked. The porch light flickered faintly, and inside, through the open door, I could see the television playing static. A cereal bowl sat on the counter, milk still in it, spoon resting on the edge. It was like someone had just walked away mid-breakfast. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone home?" And the sound of my own voice made me flinch. It came out too loud, too real, like it didn't belong there. No answer came, but the swing behind me had stopped moving. I stepped inside just far enough to see the living room. The carpet was clean but damp, like it had absorbed humidity for weeks. A clock on the wall ticked quietly, yet every second felt drawn out, delayed. I remember thinking that the air smelled faintly like metal, and that detail stuck with me more than anything else. I called out again, softer this time, but my voice didn't carry far. There were family photos on the wall. 2 kids, a man in work clothes, a woman with dark hair, but all of the frames faced slightly downward, as if someone had adjusted them that way on purpose. A noise came from deeper inside the house, something light, like a foot dragging over linoleum. I froze in the doorway and listened. It happened again, slower, almost deliberate. My first thought was that someone needed help, but then I noticed the hallway lights turning off one by one, from the far end toward me. Each bulb dimmed with a faint pop, until only the living room lamp remained. My pulse hammered in my ears. I took a slow step backward toward the porch, trying not to make a sound, and that was when I saw movement in the reflection of the television screen. It wasn't clear enough to make out a person, more like a shape standing halfway down the hall. It didn't move toward me. It just stood there, outlined by the last flicker of light before the living room lamp blinked out completely. I stumbled outside, nearly tripping over the porch steps, and ran to my car without daring to look back at the door. When I slammed the door shut, the automatic headlights illuminated the front of the house. The porch light had gone dark, but in every other house up the street, the lights were still burning bright. I drove off fast enough to send gravel flying. The road twisted for miles, but every few turns I'd glimpse another cluster of houses, each one with that same eerie pattern. Lights on, doors wide open, no one in sight. I kept expecting to see a police car, a roadblock, something that would explain it, but the road only stretched farther into black fields. When my gas light started blinking again, I nearly panicked, thinking I'd never find my way back. Then out of nowhere, I saw the glow of a highway sign ahead. The sign didn't name a place I recognized, but the sight of it was enough to make me pull over and breathe for a second. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel, and my throat felt raw. Behind me, the road stretched into total darkness. No headlights, no glow from those houses. I turned my car around to check just to see if they were still there, but the moment I faced that direction again, the road was empty. It was like that whole stretch of town had folded in on itself. When I reached the highway, traffic had returned. Trucks, headlights, the hum of normal life. I took the next exit with an open diner and stumbled inside, still in my scrubs, smelling like antiseptic and fear. The waitress gave me a worried look and asked if I was okay. I told her I'd taken a wrong turn near the gas station a few miles back, but she frowned and said there hadn't been a gas station out that way in years. She even called over a man sitting at the counter, some local driver, who confirmed it used to exist but burned down sometime in the early 2000s. I thought maybe I'd just mixed things up. Maybe the exhaustion had finally caught up to me. But when I walked back to my car after finishing my coffee, there was a layer of fine gray dust coating the hood, like ash. I touched it with my fingertips, and it smeared dark, greasy, like soot. My shoes left faint prints of it on the floor mat when I drove home. I cleaned the car the next day, but I swear the smell lingered, faint, metallic, like the air inside that empty house. I have never found that road again, no matter how many times I tried tracing my route. I even showed the area on the map to a coworker once, and she said it looked like farmland, nothing else. Still, sometimes when I drive home after night shifts, I catch a glimpse of porch lights glowing far off past the tree line. Small, steady dots in the dark. And every single time I make sure to stay on the highway. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Indianapolis was already 2 hours behind me when I decided to skip the interstate and take the back roads home that October evening. I'd just finished a job interview at a pharmaceutical company, my third that month since getting laid off. And honestly, the thought of sitting in rush hour traffic while replaying another rejection in my head seemed unbearable. Being 29 and starting over from scratch wasn't part of the plan, but neither was the factory closure that left half my town unemployed, so here I was, choosing random county roads through rural Indiana just to feel like I had some control over something. The cornfields rose up on both sides like canyon walls, dry and rustling in that late harvest way that makes everything sound like whispers. I'd lived in Fort Wayne my whole life, but these particular backroads were new to me, each turn revealing another stretch of identical stalks that seemed to go on forever, broken only by the occasional weathered barn or grain silo standing against the dimming sky. My phone battery was at 12% when I noticed the GPS had stopped updating 20 minutes ago. The little blue dot frozen somewhere near a town called Millbrook that I'd never heard of. The screen showed 6:52 p.m., and the October sun was already sinking behind the corn, throwing long shadows across the dirt road I'd somehow ended up on. I kept telling myself the next intersection would bring me back to pavement, back to civilization. But each turn just led deeper into the maze of agricultural roads that probably only made sense to the farmers who'd been driving them for generations. The Nissan Altima wasn't exactly built for this terrain. Every pothole sent a worrying creak through the suspension, and dust was billowing up behind me in thick clouds that caught the dying light. When the road narrowed to barely more than a tractor path, corn stalks scraping against both sides of my car, with a sound like fingernails on metal, I finally admitted to myself that I was completely, utterly lost. The engine started making the noise around 7:15, just as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the horizon. It began as a subtle clicking, like a playing card and bicycle spokes, but within minutes it had evolved into this grinding metal-on-metal sound that made my chest tight with panic. The temperature gauge was creeping toward the red zone, and wisps of steam were starting to curl up from under the hood, visible in the beams of my headlights that now provided the only illumination on this forgotten stretch of dirt. I pumped the brakes, feeling the car shudder and resist until I finally came to a stop in what seemed like the middle of absolute nowhere. The silence that followed when I turned off the ignition was complete. No distant highway noise, no dogs barking, not even the sound of farming equipment. Just the ticking of hot metal cooling and the endless rustling of corn that surrounded me on all sides, so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet into the rows even with my high beams on. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring at my phone as it searched desperately for even a single bar of signal. Nothing. The battery dropped to 11% while I watched, and I realized I needed to save what little power remained in case I found a spot with coverage. My hands were trembling, not from cold but from that special kind of fear that comes when you realize exactly how alone and unprepared you are. The nearest town I could remember passing was at least 40 minutes back, and that was when the car was actually running. I popped the hood release and stepped out into the October night, immediately hit by how much colder it had gotten once the sun went down. The air smelled like dried corn husks and diesel fuel, and underneath that, something else. Maybe fertilizer. Maybe just the scent of soil that had been baking all day and was now releasing its heat into the darkness. The hood was too hot to touch at first, and when I finally got it propped open, a cloud of steam billowed out, making me stumble backward into the dirt road. I knew absolutely nothing about cars beyond checking oil and adding windshield fluid, another life skill I'd always relied on others to handle. The engine block was making these pinging sounds as it cooled, and I could see fluid dripping steadily onto the ground, creating a dark puddle that looked black in the beam of my phone's flashlight. That's when I noticed it, a pinpoint of light moving through the corn, maybe 200 yards away, swaying slightly like someone walking with a flashlight. Relief flooded through me so fast I actually laughed out loud. Thank God, I thought. A farmer checking his fields, or maybe someone else whose car had broken down earlier. I raised my arm and was about to shout when something made me hesitate. The light wasn't moving along the rows like you'd expect from someone walking between planted corn. It was cutting straight through, stalks snapping and rustling, heading directly toward me. I stood there next to my dead car, watching that light get closer, and every instinct I had started screaming that something was wrong. Who walks through corn like that at night? The stalks are planted in rows specifically so you can walk between them during harvest. But this person, if it was a person, was bulldozing straight through like the corn wasn't even there. The sound reached me then, that distinctive crack and swoosh of breaking stalks, getting louder with each passing second. I turned in a slow circle, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing in the middle of this dirt road, with my car's headlights creating a bubble of visibility that probably made me look like a lighthouse in an ocean of darkness. There were no farmhouses visible in any direction, no distant porch lights or barn security lamps, just walls of corn that could have been hiding anything. The light stopped moving for a moment, maybe 100 yards away now, and I could swear whoever was holding it was watching me, evaluating, deciding something. My mouth went dry as I tried to call out a greeting, but the words died in my throat when the light started moving again. Faster this time, with purpose. The sound of breaking corn stalks grew louder, more violent, like someone was running through them now instead of walking. I scrambled back into my car, slamming the door and hitting the lock button so hard my finger hurt. The rational part of my brain kept saying this was probably just a farmer, maybe angry about someone being on his property. But farmers don't move like that through their own fields. They don't destroy their own crops. Through my windshield, I could see the light getting closer, maybe 50 yards now, and I could make out the shadowy outline of corn stalks falling away from whatever was pushing through them. My phone showed 9% battery when I tried calling 911, but the call wouldn't connect. Just that horrible beeping sound that means no signal, not even for emergency calls. Then the light went out. Just like that, complete darkness where it had been, and the sound of breaking corn stopped too. The silence was worse than the noise had been because now I had no idea where they were or what they were doing. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, breathing so hard the windows were starting to fog up, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my pulse in my ears. A minute passed, then two, and I was just starting to think maybe they'd given up and left when something slammed into the passenger side of my car, hard enough to rock it on its suspension. I couldn't help the scream that ripped out of me as I jerked away from the door, my elbow hitting the horn which blared out into the darkness. Through the fogged passenger window, I could barely make out a shape, human-sized but wrong somehow, just standing there, perfectly still. Then came the sound that still wakes me up at night, fingernails slowly dragging across the glass, deliberate and patient, like someone testing how strong it was. The scratching moved around the car methodically, passenger window, rear passenger, back windshield, then stopping at the driver's side, right next to where I was hunched against the center console trying to make myself as small as possible. This close, even through the fogged glass, I could see more details that made my whole body go rigid with terror. The person was wearing what looked like a medical gown, the thin kind they give you at hospitals, completely inappropriate for the cold October night. Their hair was long and matted, hanging in clumps that might have been blonde once but now looked gray with dirt or worse. But it was the eyes that made me bite down on my knuckle to keep from screaming again, wide open, unblinking, staring at me through the window with an intensity that felt like being studied by something that had forgotten how to be human. They raised one hand and placed it flat against the glass, and I could see dirt caked under those long fingernails, what might have been dried blood on their wrist. They tilted their heads slowly, like a dog hearing a strange sound, never breaking eye contact. I fumbled for my phone with numb fingers, desperate enough to try 911 again even though I knew it wouldn't work. 7% battery now. The figure outside started making sounds, not words exactly, more like attempts at words, these wet gurgling noises that might have been speech if their throat wasn't damaged somehow. They kept tapping on the window with one finger, gentle and rhythmic, like they were trying to communicate in code. That's when I noticed the medical bracelet on their wrist, the plastic kind with printed information. Though I couldn't read it through the fog and darkness, a horrible thought crept into my mind. What if this person had escaped from somewhere, maybe a psychiatric facility or hospital? Indiana has several state facilities and someone in a medical gown wandering rural roads at night. But that didn't explain how they'd moved through the corn, or why they seemed to be enjoying this, because I swear I could see the corners of their mouth pulling up in something that wasn't quite a smile but wanted to be. The tapping stopped abruptly, and the figure stepped back from my car, disappearing into the darkness beyond my headlights' reach. For a moment, I dared to hope they were leaving, but then I heard the trunk pop open. I'd locked the doors but forgotten the trunk release was broken. It had been that way for months, just another repair I couldn't afford. The car shifted as weight settled into the trunk area, and I could hear them rummaging through my emergency kit, metal clanking against metal. The tire iron, they'd found the tire iron. Panic shot through me like electricity as I turned the ignition key, pumping the gas pedal and pleading with the dead engine to somehow miraculously start. Nothing but clicks and the wheeze of a motor that had given up. The trunk slammed shut, and footsteps circled back to my door, slow and measured. Then came the first hit, the tire iron smashing into my side mirror, sending plastic and glass spraying across the dirt. They weren't trying to break in yet, just showing me they could, demonstrating what was about to happen. I did the only thing I could think of, laid on the horn and didn't let up. The blaring sound split the night, echoing off the corn and hopefully, reaching someone. Anyone who might call the police. The figure outside actually stumbled backward, hands going to their ears, that grotesque almost smile turning into a grimace of pain or anger. They swung the tire iron at my windshield but missed, hitting the hood instead with a metallic clang that left a dent I could see even in the darkness. My phone battery hit 5% as I kept my palm pressed on the horn, watching this person in a hospital gown rage against my car, swinging the tire iron wildly now, no longer methodical but furious. They tried to scream something over the noise, but it came out as more of that liquid gargling, and I realized with sick certainty that something was definitely wrong with their throat. Maybe self-inflicted, maybe the reason they'd been institutionalized in the first place. The horn kept blaring and I kept pressing, even as my ears rang and my head pounded, because stopping meant silence, and silence meant they'd start working on getting inside again. Then I saw them, headlights cutting through the darkness from the direction I'd come, bouncing over the rutted dirt road. The figure in the hospital gown saw them too, their heads snapping toward the approaching lights with animal-like alertness. They dropped the tire iron and, without any hesitation, turned and crashed back into the corn, vanishing into the stalks as suddenly as they'd appeared. The gurgling sounds faded quickly, swallowed by the rustling maze of dried corn that seemed to close behind them like water. I kept the horn going until the vehicle, a massive John Deere green pickup, pulled up beside me, an older man with a gray beard rolling down his window with a concerned, confused expression. I finally let go of the horn, my palm throbbing, ears ringing in the sudden quiet. The farmer, because that's what he was, asked if I was okay, said he'd been checking his irrigation equipment 2 fields over when he heard the horn going crazy. I tried to explain about the person in the hospital gown, pointing at the smashed mirror, the dents in my car, but my words came out jumbled and hysterical. He believed me though, told me there'd been an escape from Logansport State Hospital earlier that day, some patient with a history of violence who'd injured 2 orderlies getting out. The police had been searching the main roads, but nobody thought to check these back farm routes. He called it in on his CB radio while I sat there shaking, then waited with me for 40 minutes until the state police arrived with their dogs and searchlights. They found the tire iron right where it had been dropped, found footprints and torn fabric on a corn stalk, but the person was gone, swallowed up by miles and miles of agricultural land. The police took my statement, arranged for a tow truck, gave me a ride to a motel in the nearest town. They caught the patient 3 days later, hiding in an abandoned grain silo near Lafayette, nearly dead from exposure and dehydration. I never learned their name or what they'd done to end up in that hospital, and honestly, I didn't want to know. What I do know is that I haven't driven anywhere without a charger cable since, and I take the interstate now, always the interstate, no matter how bad the traffic is. The farmhouse came cheap because nobody wanted to drive 40 minutes just to get groceries. That suited me fine after the divorce papers went through in August. 37 and starting fresh seemed easier when the nearest neighbor lived 2 miles down the gravel road. The property stretched maybe 5 acres total, most of it taken up by corn that the previous tenant had planted but never harvested. By the time I moved in that September, those stalks stood almost 7 feet tall, creating a dense green wall that ran right up to my backyard. The realtor, Nancy something or other, kept apologizing about the unkempt field, promising the owner would have it cleared before winter. I told her not to worry about it. The rustling sound at night actually helped me sleep, like white noise from nature instead of those machines people buy in the city. The first signs appeared maybe 3 weeks after I settled in. I'd gone out one morning to drink coffee on the back porch, watching the sun climb over those endless rows of corn, when I spotted a crumpled McDonald's wrapper near where the grass met the field, then a Marlboro butt, still fresh enough that the filter hadn't yellowed from rain. My first thought was teenagers, probably local kids who'd found a spot to smoke where their parents wouldn't catch them. God knows I'd done the same thing at their age, sneaking behind the gymnasium with stolen cigarettes. The muddy footprint on my deck bothered me more, but October had been wet, and delivery drivers never watched where they stepped. I grabbed a trash bag, picked up the litter, and made a mental note to mention it to Nancy next time she called to check how I was settling in. Kids would be kids, and eventually they'd get bored and find somewhere else to hang out. A week passed before I found the makeshift bed. I'd been walking along the field's edge, looking for my cat Brutus, who liked to hunt mice in the tall grass, when I noticed how the corn stalks bent inward about 20 feet from my bedroom window. Not broken, just carefully pushed aside to create a narrow tunnel. Curiosity got the better of me, and I ducked into the opening, pushing through the dense leaves that scratched at my arms. The smell hit me first, stale sweat mixed with something chemical, like old cologne trying to mask body odor. Someone had flattened maybe 6 feet of corn stalks into a rough oval, creating a hidden pocket completely invisible from the outside. Empty beer cans lined one edge. A ratty sleeping bag lay crumpled in the corner, still damp from the morning dew. But what made my throat close up was the collection of cigarette butts arranged in a neat little pyramid, all Marlboros, all facing the same direction, toward my house. The logical part of my brain kept insisting this was still teenagers, maybe some kid who'd gotten kicked out and needed a place to crash. But teenagers didn't organize their trash like that. Teenagers didn't position themselves with a perfect sightline to my bedroom window, where the corn had been bent just enough to create a gap no bigger than a fist. I backed out of that space, my shirt catching on the rough stalks, and walked straight into my house to call the sheriff's department. The deputy who showed up, a young guy named Brandon who couldn't have been older than 25, walked through the space with me, took some photos, and promised they'd increase patrols. He suggested motion lights for the backyard and maybe some cameras if I could afford them. The way he kept checking his phone and glancing at his watch told me everything. Weird trash in a cornfield didn't exactly qualify as an emergency in his book. I installed the motion lights that same afternoon, driving to the hardware store in town and spending money I didn't really have on 4 industrial-strength floodlights. The clerk, an older man with grease under his fingernails, helped me pick out the brightest ones they had, the kind that would blind you if you looked directly at them. While I was there, I grabbed a deadbolt for the back door and one of those wooden dowels to jam in the sliding glass door track. The installation took me until dark, up and down the ladder with a drill that kept slipping in my sweaty palms. Every rustle from the corn made me whip around, expecting to see someone standing there. But the field stayed empty, just endless rows swaying in the evening breeze. That night the lights triggered constantly. A raccoon at midnight, wind-blown leaves at 2, a possum around 4. Each time that harsh white light flooded my yard, I'd jolt awake and peer through the blinds, scanning the illuminated grass for footprints, for movement, for anything that would prove I wasn't going crazy. The silence lasted 5 days. 5 days of motion lights catching nothing but animals. 5 days of checking that spot in the corn to find it undisturbed. 5 days of almost convincing myself that whoever it was had been scared off by the deputy's visit. Then, on Saturday night, all 4 lights went out at once. Not triggered, just dead like someone had cut the power. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but the screen stayed black no matter how many times I pressed the button. The landline in the kitchen gave me nothing but silence. Even my laptop, which had been charging on the counter, wouldn't turn on. I stood in my dark kitchen, listening to my own breathing mix with the eternal rustling of corn. And that's when I heard it. The distinct sound of a sliding door being tested. That soft bump when someone lifts it to see if it's locked. The dowel held, but whoever was out there kept trying, patient and methodical, lifting and releasing, like they had all the time in the world. The testing stopped after maybe 10 minutes, but I knew he hadn't left. Through the kitchen window, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow passing between my car and the shed, too tall and upright to be an animal. My keys hung on the hook by the front door, 15 feet away, but reaching them meant crossing in front of the living room windows. The old farmhouse had too many windows, I realized. Windows I'd loved when I moved in because they let in so much natural light. Now each dark pane felt like an eye, like someone could be pressed against any of them, watching me stand frozen in my kitchen. I grabbed a knife from the block, the big one I used for chopping vegetables, and tried to think. The nearest neighbor, the Gibsons, lived 2 miles away. Even if I ran, even if I made it to the road, it would take 20 minutes to reach their house. 20 minutes in the dark with someone following through the corn, knowing every shortcut while I stumbled blind down the gravel road. A soft knock on the back door made me bite down on my own tongue to keep from screaming. Not pounding or aggressive, just 3 gentle taps, like a neighbor stopping by to borrow sugar. Then his voice came through the wood, conversational and calm, with this odd sing-song quality that made my spine go rigid. "I know you're awake in there. I've been watching you for weeks now, learning your routines. You make chamomile tea before bed, read those mystery novels in your bedroom until your eyes get heavy. You sleep on your left side, facing the window. Did you know you talk in your sleep sometimes? Mostly about work stress. But last night you said a man's name. Christopher. Is that the ex-husband? He knew things no one could know unless they'd been inside my house, unless they'd stood next to my bed while I slept. The knife felt useless in my hand, a joke against someone who'd been close enough to hear me breathing in the dark, and I'd never even known. "The police won't come," he continued, his mouth so close to the door I could hear his lips brush the wood. "Your phone's dead, remember? And even if you got to your car, well, I took care of that earlier. Cut the fuel line while you were in the shower this evening. You use lavender shampoo, by the way. The smell carries through the bathroom vent." My legs started shaking so hard I had to lean against the counter to stay upright. This morning's shower, I'd felt safe, normal, washing my hair and planning my weekend. He'd been right outside, close enough to smell my shampoo, sabotaging my car while I stood naked and vulnerable behind a thin curtain. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, and I heard something metal scraping against the door frame. "You're going to let me in, and we're going to talk about why you've been so rude, ignoring me when I've put so much effort into getting to know you. Or I'm going to come in anyway and we'll have a very different conversation." The scraping sound meant he was working on the lock, and the old farmhouse doors weren't exactly high security. I had maybe 2 minutes before he got through. The front door was an option, but running into the dark meant running blind while he knew the property better than I did after weeks of surveillance. Hiding seemed pointless when he'd already proven he could get inside whenever he wanted. Then I remembered the crawl space access in the bedroom closet. The realtor had mentioned it during the tour, apologizing for the lack of a proper basement. It led under the house, coming out through a wooden panel near the front porch that looked decorative from the outside. If I could get into the crawl space before he broke through the back door, maybe I could slip out the front while he searched the house. I moved as quietly as I could toward the bedroom, avoiding the creaky board near the hallway that I'd learned about my first week here. Behind me, the scraping continued, mixed with his humming. Some tune I didn't recognize, cheerful and wrong in the darkness. The crawl space was exactly as horrible as I'd imagined. maybe 3 feet high, dirt floor, thick with spider webs and the smell of rotting wood. I pulled the panel closed behind me and started crawling, trying not to think about what else might be down here with me. My knees sank into the soft earth, and something with too many legs skittered across my hand. Above me, I heard the back door finally give way, then heavy footsteps moving through my kitchen. "Where did you go?" His voice was louder now, annoyed rather than conversational. "This doesn't have to be difficult. I've been patient, haven't I? Weeks of watching, waiting for the right time to introduce myself properly." The footsteps moved toward the living room and I crawled faster, my fingers searching for the panel that should be somewhere ahead. The space narrowed as I went, forcing me to army crawl on my belly through dirt that tasted like decay when I accidentally breathed through my mouth. His footsteps stopped directly overhead, and I heard him opening closet doors, checking rooms, methodical in his search. My fingers finally found the wooden panel, and I pushed against it slowly, terrified it would creak. Cool night air hit my face as it opened, and I could see my front yard bathed in moonlight, the road just 50 yards away. I squeezed through the opening, dirt in my hair and eyes, and started running before I was even fully standing. Behind me, I heard him yell. Not words, just raw frustration when he realized I wasn't in the house. The gravel road tore at my bare feet, but I kept running, powered by adrenaline and terror. Halfway to the Gibsons' house, headlights appeared ahead, their teenage son Nathan coming home late from work. I practically threw myself in front of his truck, screaming for help, probably looking absolutely insane covered in dirt and spiderwebs. But Nathan didn't hesitate. He pulled me into the truck, locked the doors, and drove straight to his parents' house while calling 911 on his cell. When the real deputies arrived an hour later, not Brandon but older officers who took everything seriously, they found my back door broken, muddy footprints through my house, and that sleeping spot in the corn. But the man himself was gone, vanished into the miles of farmland and forest that surrounded the county. They never caught him. The investigation turned up DNA from the sleeping bag, fingerprints on my door frame, but nothing in any database. The detective assigned to my case a woman named Diane Russell, who'd worked stalking cases for 15 years, told me that wasn't unusual. "Some of these guys, they're ghosts until they escalate," she said, sitting across from me at the police station, while I gave my 5th statement. "You were smart to run. Smart to trust your instincts about those first signs." They found more evidence in the corn over the following days. Notebooks wrapped in plastic with detailed observations about my daily routines. Photographs taken through my windows with a telephoto lens. Even recordings of my phone conversations somehow captured from outside the house. The quantity suggested he'd been watching for months before I moved in. That maybe he'd been watching the property itself, waiting for someone like me, alone, isolated, vulnerable, to rent it. The owner had the corn cleared within a week, revealing 3 other makeshift camps at different vantage points around the property, each one positioned to watch a different side of the house. I stayed with the Gibsons for 2 weeks, while I arranged to break the lease and find somewhere new to live. A studio apartment in Columbus with a doorman and security cameras, neighbors close enough to hear if I screamed. The landlord tried to keep my security deposit, claiming I'd violated the lease terms, until Diane made a few phone calls and suddenly he was very accommodating, even refunding my last month's rent. Sometimes I Google the address of that farmhouse, checking if anyone new has rented it. So far, it stays empty. The listing photos showing my former bedroom with its big windows, the cleared field behind it looking naked and exposed without the corn. I still wake up some nights, convinced I can hear that patient lifting and releasing of a door, that cheerful humming in the darkness. My therapist says it's normal, that hypervigilance takes time to fade. But I notice things now, how many windows a place has, whether the doors are solid wood or hollow, if there are too many blind spots around a property. And I'll never again ignore those first small signs, those little violations that your mind wants to explain away. Because somewhere out there, he's probably doing it again, picking some other isolated farmhouse, some other woman living alone, starting with cigarette butts and footprints while he learns her routines. Patient and methodical, waiting for the perfect night to finally introduce himself. The cornfield behind the Brennan property stretches for what feels like miles, and during late August of 2022, the stalks stood nearly 8 feet tall, creating these dense walls of green that whispered whenever the wind picked up. I'd driven out there with my girlfriend Jess and our friend group for what was supposed to be just another bonfire before everyone scattered for college again. The Brennans owned about 200 acres of farmland outside Cedar Rapids, and their daughter Allison had been hosting these gatherings since we were 16. That night, there were maybe 12 of us sitting around the fire pit they'd built about 50 yards from where the corn started, passing around cheap beer and talking about nothing important, while sparks drifted up toward the stars. Allison had just turned 19 the week before, and she kept joking about how this might be our last real summer together before adult life swallowed us whole. Around 11 that night, Allison's phone slipped out of her hoodie pocket when she stood up to grab another drink from the cooler, and we all heard it hit something hard before bouncing into the darkness toward the cornfield. She laughed and said she'd be right back, turned on her phone's flashlight using Jess's phone to call hers so it would light up, and walked toward the edge of the corn where we could hear it buzzing. The stalks swallowed her immediately, but we could track her movement by the glow of the flashlight filtering through the corn, and her voice calling out that she could see it, just a little further in. Her friend Kayla was recording some stupid video for Instagram and actually caught Allison disappearing between the rows, this casual moment that would later become evidence. We kept talking and laughing, waiting for her to come back, but after maybe 3 or 4 minutes, her boyfriend Noah called out asking if she needed help, and that's when we realized we couldn't see the flashlight anymore or hear her moving through the stalks. Noah stood up first, cupping his hands around his mouth and shouting her name into the darkness, and the rest of us quickly joined him at the edge of the cornfield, our voices overlapping as we called for Allison. The corn seemed to absorb our shouts, muffling them into nothing, and all we could hear was our own breathing and the constant rustling of leaves brushing against each other in the breeze. 5 of us formed a line and walked into the field together, arms outstretched so we wouldn't lose each other, moving slowly through the rows while calling her name every few seconds. The stalks were so thick that even with our phone flashlights, we could only see maybe 2 feet ahead, and the leaves kept slapping against our faces and arms, leaving these thin scratches that stung with sweat. After 20 minutes of searching, we found her phone lying face down in the dirt between 2 rows, the screen cracked but still glowing with Jess's missed calls. And that's when the real panic set in because Allison would never leave her phone behind, not even as a joke. We spent the next 3 hours searching that field, our voices getting hoarse from screaming her name, stumbling through the endless rows until our phones started dying one by one. Noah was practically hyperventilating, convinced she'd fallen and hit her head somewhere, while Kayla kept insisting we should have heard something, anything, if Allison had gotten hurt or lost, because sound carries weird in cornfields, but it doesn't just disappear entirely. By 2 in the morning, someone finally convinced Noah to call 911, and within an hour, the place was swarming with sheriff's deputies, volunteer firefighters, and search and rescue teams with powerful floodlights that lit up sections of the field like daylight. They brought in thermal imaging equipment, thinking maybe she'd passed out somewhere in the corn, and 2 different K9 units that both tracked her scent about 30 feet into the field before losing it completely, which the handlers said almost never happens unless someone gets into a vehicle. The Brennans came out in their bathrobes, Allison's mother Claire collapsing against her husband when she realized her daughter wasn't just playing some elaborate prank, and the sound she made was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, this raw wail that seemed to echo across the entire property. When the sun came up around 6 that morning, they had over 50 people walking shoulder to shoulder through the cornfield in a grid pattern, marking each row with orange tape as they cleared it. That's when one of the deputies found the footprints, a single set of bare feet in the soft dirt, that started about 40 feet from where we'd found the phone, which made no sense because Allison had been wearing these beat-up Converse sneakers with smiley faces she'd drawn on them in Sharpie. The prints were small, definitely hers based on the size, and they followed this bizarre path through the corn, weaving between rows seemingly at random, before making a sharp turn toward the gravel road that ran along the eastern edge of the property. The detective taking photos kept muttering about how clean the impressions were. No drag marks or signs of struggle. Just deliberate steps from someone who had apparently stopped to take off their shoes in the middle of a cornfield at night for no logical reason. They followed those prints for nearly a quarter mile, past the point where anyone at the bonfire could have possibly heard her, all the way to where the corn ended and the road began. At the edge of the road, the footprint simply stopped, right there in the middle of nothing. No car tracks in the gravel, no signs of anyone else having been there. Just this abrupt end like she'd stepped off the earth entirely. The forensics team photographed every print, measured the stride length, took soil samples, even brought in some specialist from the state police who'd worked missing persons cases for 20 years, and he stood there staring at those last few footprints for almost an hour without saying anything. Later, when the detective interviewed us individually at the station, he kept asking these specific questions about whether Allison had seemed different lately, whether she'd mentioned meeting anyone online, whether she'd ever talked about wanting to disappear, and it was clear they thought she'd planned this somehow. But those of us who knew her understood that was impossible, because Allison had just gotten accepted into the nursing program at the University of Iowa, had already paid her deposit, had spent the whole night talking about her classes starting in 2 weeks, and she'd never, ever leave Noah without at least saying goodbye, not after they'd been together since sophomore year of high school. The thing that haunts me most happened 3 days after she disappeared, when the detective called us back to the station and showed us what they'd recovered from her phone. Most of it was normal stuff, texts about the bonfire, photos from earlier that night. But there was this recording that had started at 11:47 p.m., about 10 minutes after she'd walked into the corn, and it ran for nearly 2 hours before the battery died. The first few minutes were just rustling sounds and her breathing, normal enough, but then the breathing changed, became deeper and more rhythmic like she was walking with purpose, and you could hear her moving through the corn at a steady pace, never stumbling or stopping to look around. About 30 minutes in, there was this weird moment where the rustling stopped completely for maybe 10 seconds. Total silence except for her breathing, and then it resumed, but with this strange echo quality, like she was in a much larger space than just between corn rows. The detective played it for us on these high-end speakers, and we all heard it, this subtle shift in the acoustic quality that made no sense given where she was supposed to be. The really disturbing part came near the end of the recording, around the 90-minute mark, when you could hear what sounded like Allison humming this tune none of us recognized, just 5 or 6 notes repeated over and over. And her breathing had become so calm, it was almost like she was in some kind of trance. Then right before the phone died, there was this sound that made everyone in that room lean forward. A voice that was definitely Allison's but speaking in this flat, emotionless tone saying numbers. 4, 12, 37, 9, 22. Just random numbers with no pattern anyone could figure out. The FBI got involved at that point, running the audio through every kind of analysis, checking those numbers against everything from GPS coordinates to dates to code sequences. But they found nothing that made sense. Noah listened to that recording probably 100 times, convinced there was some message in it, some clue we were missing, until his parents finally made him stop because he wasn't sleeping anymore, just sitting in his room with headphones on, playing those numbers over and over. 2 weeks later, they found her shoes, both of them, placed neatly side by side on the shoulder of Highway 30, almost 15 miles from the Brennan property, sitting there like she'd just stepped out of them to walk barefoot down the asphalt. They were definitely hers, those Converse with the smiley faces, and they were clean. No mud or corn silk or anything that suggested they'd been in that field, which made no sense because we'd all seen her wearing them that night. The laces were still tied in her specific way, this double knot she always did because she hated when they came undone. And inside the left shoe was a receipt from a gas station none of us had ever heard of. Time-stamped at 2:47 a.m. the night she disappeared, for a bottle of water and a pack of spearmint gum paid in cash. The detective drove out to that gas station, this little 24-hour place way out on some back road, and the night clerk remembered a girl matching Allison's description coming in around that time, but said she seemed perfectly normal, maybe a little quiet, and that she'd left on foot heading north even though he'd asked if she needed help finding something. What really messed with our heads was the security footage from that gas station, because it clearly showed Allison walking in at 2:46 a.m., barefoot and wearing the same clothes from the bonfire, moving with this strange, purposeful stride like she knew exactly where she was going. She bought the items, had a brief conversation with the clerk where she apparently told him she was going to see the Rose End, whatever that meant, and then walked out and turned north just like he'd said. The camera outside caught her walking along the edge of the road for about 30 seconds before she disappeared into the darkness, and that was the last confirmed sighting of her. The police searched every inch of ground between that gas station and where they'd found her shoes, brought in helicopters with infrared cameras, even drained a pond half a mile away, but found nothing else. No clothing, no footprints, no sign that Allison had ever been anywhere near that stretch of highway. The investigation went on for months, with detectives following every possible lead, interviewing anyone who'd had contact with Allison in the weeks before she disappeared, checking traffic cameras from every intersection within a 50-mile radius, but they never found another trace of her. They discovered she'd been researching weird stuff online in the days before the bonfire, agricultural patterns, and something called liminality in rural spaces, which turned out to be some academic paper about psychological effects of repetitive landscapes like cornfields. But her browser history was otherwise normal, just college stuff and music videos. Her parents hired a private investigator who spent 6 months retracing every step, even brought in some expert on missing persons who'd worked cases all over the Midwest. But he just confirmed what we already knew. People don't just vanish like this, walking barefoot out of a cornfield in the middle of the night with no explanation, no motive, no destination that anyone could identify. The hardest part was watching the Brennans slowly accept that their daughter might never come home, seeing them take down the missing person flyers as they weathered and faded, watching Noah transfer to a different school because he couldn't handle being in Cedar Rapids anymore. The cornfield is still there, though the Brennans don't plant it anymore. Just let it go wild with prairie grass and weeds that grow taller each summer until you can barely tell it was ever cultivated land. Sometimes I drive past on my way to visit Jess's parents, and I always slow down at that spot where the field meets the road, wondering if maybe I'll see something everyone else missed, some clue that explains where Allison went that night. The gas station clerk quit his job a few months after she disappeared. Said he kept having dreams about a girl walking north into the darkness, and the new clerk doesn't know anything about it, just shrugs when people ask about the girl who came through that night talking about Rose Ending. Noah sent me a message last month. First time I'd heard from him in over a year, just a simple question. Do you ever hear those numbers in your head? And I knew exactly what he meant because sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I hear Allison's flat voice reciting them. 4, 12, 37, 9, 22, like she's still out there somewhere, walking barefoot through endless rows of corn, following some path only she can see. Jamie always came home at 3:45, give or take 2 minutes. I'd been timing him since the start of the school year, mostly out of boredom while I waited for my shift at the hardware store to start at 5. My younger brother was 14 and predictable as clockwork. You could set your watch by the sound of him kicking off his sneakers on the back porch. October had settled over our part of Illinois with unusual cold that year, and the acres of corn behind our house had turned that particular shade of brown that meant harvest was overdue. That Wednesday, I stood at the kitchen window eating a sandwich, watching the clock tick past 4, then 4:30, and Jamie never showed. Mom was still at the dentist's office where she worked reception, and Dad wouldn't be back from the plant until after 7. By 5:15, I'd already called the school twice, walked the road to check for accidents, and finally forced myself to face what I'd been avoiding, checking the shortcut through the corn that Jamie had been using since 6th grade. My brother treated that field like his personal highway, cutting 20 minutes off his walk home every single day. He knew every deer trail, every irrigation pipe, every spot where the rows opened into small clearings. I found his entry point immediately, the same gap near the rusted fence post where he always ducked in, his handprints visible in the orange rust from years of grabbing it for balance. His footprints were fresh in the soft dirt, those beat-up Converse with the loose heel leaving their familiar marks. I followed them for about 30 yards before backing out and calling 911, trying to keep my voice steady while explaining that my brother hadn't come home. Within an hour, we had 3 sheriff's deputies tramping through our kitchen, tracking mud everywhere while Deputy Coleman explained his theory about spatial disorientation in tall crops. He said it like he was reading from a manual, like Jamie hadn't spent 4 years learning every landmark in those 200 acres, like my brother was some city kid who'd never seen corn before. They searched until midnight that first night, brought in dogs the next morning, even used a drone with thermal imaging on Friday. Nothing. The dogs tracked Jamie's scent for maybe 300 yards into the field before losing it completely, like he'd just vanished into thin air. The handler, a woman named Cheryl with deep wrinkles around her eyes, kept making her German Shepherd go back to the same spot, clearly frustrated that the trail just stopped. She asked me 3 times if there were any old wells or storm cellars in the field, and each time I told her no, just corn and dirt and more corn. The thermal drone picked up plenty of deer, a few coyotes, but no heat signature that could be Jamie. Sheriff Garrett held a press conference on Saturday talking about ongoing search efforts, while basically telling everyone that kids sometimes run away, that the corn made it hard to find anyone, that we needed to consider all possibilities. Mom stopped sleeping after that, just sat at the kitchen table staring at Jamie's school photo, while Dad drove around checking abandoned barns and talking to farmers within a 10-mile radius. By Monday, a week after Jamie disappeared, the official search was scaled back to routine patrols. I couldn't stand the waiting anymore, couldn't stand how everyone was starting to talk about my brother in past tense. That morning, after my parents left, Mom to put up more flyers, Dad to check the bus station in Peoria again, I went back to the field alone. The cops had trampled the original trail, but I knew Jamie's patterns well enough to guess his likely route. He always veered left after entering the field, following a slight ridge that kept his feet drier when the ground was muddy. I pushed through the corn, ignoring how the dry leaves cut at my arms, counting my paces like Jamie had taught me when we were kids playing hide and seek. At around 400 yards in, well past where the dogs had lost his scent, I found something the searchers had missed, a partial footprint, just the toe of his Converse preserved under a fallen cornstalk. The angle was wrong though, like he'd been walking backwards or spinning around, and the dirt around it had strange marks, almost like something had been dragged, but not quite. I kept following the disturbed earth, crawling on my knees now to see under the bent stalks, and that's when I spotted it. Jamie's backpack sitting perfectly upright against a cornstalk like someone had carefully placed it there. Not thrown, not dropped, but set down deliberately with the zippers all closed and the straps adjusted evenly. My brother was messy, always tossing his stuff around, never zipped anything properly in his life. The backpack was clean too, no dirt or moisture on it despite sitting there for a week. Inside, everything was arranged wrong. His textbooks stacked by size, his pencils all facing the same direction in their case, his half-eaten bag of chips folded closed and paper-clipped. Jamie didn't even own paper clips. About 10 feet away, positioned exactly parallel to the corn rows, I found his left shoe. Just one shoe, laces still tied in Jamie's weird double-knot style, but the shoe itself was pristine, like someone had wiped it clean before placing it there. The sock was tucked inside, folded into a perfect little square. The trail of disturbed soil continued for another 20 yards past the shoe, and I followed it, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it over the wind rattling the corn. The marks in the dirt were deliberate, not random drag patterns, but almost like symbols or letters, though I couldn't make sense of them. They led to a small clearing where several corn stalks had been bent down in a rough circle, their tops woven together overhead to form a kind of shelter or blind. Inside this space, the ground was completely smooth, swept clean of any debris or footprints. In the exact center, someone had dug a shallow depression, maybe 6 inches deep and perfectly round. The extracted dirt formed into a neat ring around it. At the bottom of the depression lay Jamie's student ID card, his house key, and 3 pennies from his pocket, arranged in a triangle. The plastic ID wasn't scratched or dirty. It looked like someone had polished it. But what made me stumble backward was what I saw pressed into the smooth dirt around these items. Dozens of footprints, all from the same shoe, all exactly the same depth, forming a spiral pattern that wound inward to the center. They were Jamie's prints from his right shoe, the one still on his foot. I ran back to the house, crashing through the corn rows without caring about the cuts on my arms, and called Sheriff Garrett directly. This time I had evidence, something concrete they couldn't dismiss as teenage runaway behavior. Garrett himself came out with 2 detectives from the state police, and I led them to the clearing, my legs shaking the whole way. They took photos of everything, bagged the items, made casts of the footprints, but I could see the confusion on their faces. Detective Mills kept asking if I was sure I hadn't touched anything, if maybe Jamie had made this himself as some kind of prank or cry for attention. I wanted to scream at him that Jamie wasn't that kind of kid, that someone had taken my brother and arranged his things like trophies. They brought in a forensics team that afternoon, and that's when things got even stranger. The footprint spiral showed Jamie had walked it at least 30 times, based on the depth and overlap, but there were no other prints anywhere, not even partials. Whoever had been with him had either never touched the ground or had carefully erased their tracks while leaving Jamie's intact. The forensics tech, a young guy named Bradley who looked fresh from college, pulled me aside while the others were documenting the scene. He showed me something on his tablet, enhanced photos of the dirt marks I'd thought might be symbols. Under magnification, they weren't random at all. They were measurements, precise distances marked in the soil, all pointing to different spots in the field. Bradley had mapped them, and they formed a grid pattern extending out from the clearing in perfectly straight lines, each endpoint exactly 150 feet from the center. He asked if Jamie was good at math, if he might have been interested in surveying or geometry. I told him Jamie could barely pass algebra, that he couldn't measure anything without messing it up. Bradley just nodded and went back to the others, but I saw him taking more photos, making notes in a separate notebook he didn't share with the detectives. Before they left, he slipped me a piece of paper with his number, told me to call if I found anything else, anything at all that seemed arranged or measured. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the grid pattern Bradley had shown me. After my parents went to bed, Mom finally knocked out by sleeping pills, Dad passed out on the couch still wearing his work boots. I grabbed a compass and measuring tape from the garage and went back to the field. The moon was nearly full, giving just enough light to navigate between the corn rows without a flashlight that might alert the neighbors. I found the clearing again and started checking Bradley's measurements, following the grid lines out to their endpoints. At the first marker, exactly 150 feet north of the clearing, I found another small depression in the ground, this one containing Jamie's calculator watch, the band cut cleanly in half. The second point to the east had his gym whistle on its lanyard, tied in a complex knot I'd never seen before. Each endpoint had something of Jamie's, all items he would have had with him that day, all placed with the same obsessive precision. The western point made me stop breathing for a full 10 seconds. There, arranged in a perfect line, were Jamie's baby teeth, the ones Mom had saved in a little box in her jewelry drawer. All 12 of them, spaced exactly 1 inch apart, pressed into the soil so only their tops were visible. How could anyone have known about those teeth? How could they have gotten into our house, into Mom's room, without us noticing? I started digging frantically around the teeth, my fingers clawing at the dirt, and about 6 inches down, I hit something solid. It was Jamie's phone, wrapped in clear plastic. The screen still showing his last text to me from that Wednesday. Home in 20. Save me some pizza. The battery was dead, but the phone was perfectly clean inside its wrapping, like someone had sealed it away for safekeeping. Underneath the phone, pressed into the clay, was a single adult footprint. Not a shoe print, but a bare foot, with unusually long toes, and what looked like a 6th toe's impression on the left side. The print was deep, deeper than my own when I stood next to it, suggesting someone much heavier despite the narrow shape of the foot. I called Bradley from the field, whispering into my phone while crouched in the corn. He answered on the second ring, like he'd been waiting for my call, and when I told him about the baby teeth and the footprint, he went silent for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Then he told me to take photos of everything but not to call the sheriff yet. He said he'd been doing some research, checking through old missing persons cases in the area, and he'd found something. 3 other kids had vanished in cornfields over the past 15 years, all within a 50-mile radius, all in October, all between the ages of 12 and 15. The cases had never been connected because they happened in different counties, different jurisdictions, but the pattern was there. Each time the official search found nothing, dogs lost the trail, and the kids were written off as runaways. Bradley had driven out to one of the old sites that afternoon, a field near Effingham that had since been developed into a subdivision. The construction crew had found strange things when they cleared the land. Items arranged in geometric patterns, footprints that didn't match any of the workers, and according to one foreman Bradley had tracked down, a complex tunnel system that didn't appear on any survey maps. The southern grid point was the last one I checked, and I almost wished I hadn't. There, in a shallow hole covered with carefully arranged corn husks, was a stack of photographs. They were all of Jamie, taken over the course of months, maybe years. Jamie walking to school, Jamie in our backyard, Jamie through his bedroom window. Some were so recent I recognized the clothes, the shirt he'd worn the previous week, the jacket he'd gotten for his birthday in September. But others were older, showing Jamie at 12, at 10, even one that looked like it was taken when he was maybe 7 or 8, at a school field day I barely remembered. Whoever had taken these had been watching my brother for half his life, had been in our neighborhood, near our house, close enough to photograph him through windows. At the bottom of the stack was a hand-drawn map of our property and the cornfield, marked with dates and times, noting Jamie's routes and routines with terrifying accuracy. The final notation, written in small, precise handwriting, was for that Wednesday, 3:15 p.m., intercept at position 7. Position 7 was marked deep in the field, right around where the dogs had lost Jamie's scent. Bradley arrived at the field 40 minutes later with ground-penetrating radar equipment he'd borrowed from the university. We worked in silence, scanning the area around position 7. And just before dawn, the equipment detected an anomaly, a void about 8 feet underground, extending horizontally for at least 20 feet before the signal degraded. Bradley called in favors, got a full FBI team out there by noon, told them about the pattern of disappearances, the photographs, everything. They brought in excavation equipment, and by evening they'd broken through into a narrow tunnel, hand-dug and reinforced with scavenged materials, leading to a series of small chambers carved from the clay. The smell that came up from that hole, earth and something else, something organic and wrong, made everyone step back. The FBI sent in a robot with a camera first, and when they saw what was down there, they cleared everyone out except essential personnel. They found Jamie alive in the 3rd chamber, semi-conscious and dehydrated but breathing, along with 2 other kids, a girl from Champaign who'd gone missing 3 weeks earlier, and a boy from Decatur whose parents had reported him as a runaway 6 days ago. The man they arrested lived alone in a farmhouse 4 miles away, had worked as a surveyor for the county 20 years ago, before an injury left him on disability. Harold Jenks, 63 years old, 6'4", with a birth defect that gave him an extra toe on his left foot. He'd been using the tunnel system for over a decade, expanding it each year, accessing it through hidden entrances in 3 different cornfields. The FBI found journals in his house, thousands of pages documenting his observations of children, his selection process, his careful planning. He wrote about keeping them underground during the harvest season, when the noise of machinery would mask any sounds, then moving them through the tunnels to different locations, always staying ahead of the searches. Jamie doesn't remember much. Jenks had drugged him with something that affected his memory, made him compliant enough to walk that spiral pattern over and over, while Jenks watched from a blind he'd built in the corn. The other kids had similar gaps in their memories, just fragments of darkness and the sound of corn rustling overhead. Jenks pleaded guilty to avoid trial, got life without parole, and never explained why he did it beyond saying the fields told him to. Jamie came home after a week in the hospital, physically okay but different, quieter. He hasn't walked through a cornfield since, takes the long way to school now, stays on the sidewalks and paved roads. The field behind our house was harvested that November, and Dad convinced the owner to plant soybeans the next year, then wheat, anything but corn. We never talk about it, but sometimes I catch Jamie staring out his bedroom window at where the cornfield used to be, and I wonder what he's remembering, what fragments of those dark hours underground still surface in his dreams. The fence posts stretched for miles across that Nebraska property, each one needing new wire, or a complete replacement after the spring storms had torn through. I'd been picking up mechanic work at a shop in Omaha for about 6 months, when Jerry, one of the regulars, mentioned his uncle needed someone handy for a week-long job out in the country. The pay was double what I was making, cash up front, plus room and board at the farmhouse. My beat-up Chevy truck needed new tires and the rent was overdue, so I loaded my tools that Sunday morning and drove 3 hours west into nowhere. The land out there was different than anything I'd seen growing up near Denver, just endless fields of corn already standing 7 feet tall in early July, broken only by gravel roads that seemed to lead nowhere special. Walter Hoffman turned out to be somewhere past 70, with fingers bent from arthritis, and a way of squinting at you like he was trying to read fine print. His farmhouse sat alone on 800 acres, the nearest neighbor a good 4 miles down the county road. He showed me to a small room above the garage, just a mattress and a dresser that smelled like motor oil, then walked me along the fence line that needed fixing. The corn grew right up to the posts in most places, leaving these narrow corridors where I'd have to work, barely wide enough to swing a hammer. Walter said he'd planted late this year because of the rain, and the stalks were growing fast in the heat, already thick enough that you couldn't see more than a few feet into the rows. He'd leave me alone during the day, he explained, since his hip made walking hard, but dinner would be ready at 6 sharp in the main house. The first 3 days went smooth enough, just me and the fence posts under that Nebraska sun, sweat dripping while I hammered new boards and stretched wire until my arms burned. The only sounds were the meadowlarks calling from somewhere beyond the corn and this constant rustling the wind made pushing through all those leaves. Sometimes I'd catch myself stopping work just to listen to it, that ocean sound of thousands of stalks swaying together, almost hypnotic if you let it get to you. Around Wednesday afternoon, I was working a section near the back of the property when I heard something else mixed in with that rustling. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, moving through the rows about 20 yards from where I was kneeling with my pliers. I stood up and called out, thinking maybe Walter had walked out to check on my progress, but the footsteps stopped immediately, leaving just that endless whisper of corn moving in the breeze. That night at dinner, I asked Walter if anyone else ever came through the property, maybe hunters or kids from town looking for trouble. He stopped cutting his pork chop and gave me that squinting look again, like I'd asked something peculiar. Nobody had any business being on his land, he said, and nobody from town would drive all the way out here just to walk through corn. The way he said it made me feel stupid for asking, so I dropped it and focused on my plate. But when I was walking back to my room above the garage, I noticed how complete the darkness was out there. No street lights, no house lights except Walter's windows, just stars and the massive shadow of the cornfield surrounding everything. My truck sat parked by the garage, and on impulse I tried starting it just to hear the engine. But when I turned the key, nothing happened except a clicking sound from under the hood. The battery was dead, completely drained even though I'd just driven it 3 days ago without any problems. I popped the hood with my phone flashlight since the garage had no overhead light, and everything looked normal. No loose cables, no corrosion on the terminals. I figured I'd ask Walter for a jump in the morning, but when I checked my phone to set an alarm, the screen showed no signal bars at all. Not even one. I'd had at least 2 bars the first day, enough to text my roommate that I'd arrived safely. Now the phone was basically a brick, useless except as a flashlight. Standing there between my dead truck and that wall of corn just 30 feet away, I felt this weight settle in my chest. Like when you realize you've made a mistake but can't quite name what it is yet. The corn rustled louder in the night breeze, and I swear I heard those same measured footsteps again, closer this time, maybe just inside the first row of stalks. Friday morning came with fog so thick I couldn't see the cornfield from my window, just white mist pressed against the glass like cotton. I found Walter in his kitchen already drinking coffee, and when I mentioned my truck trouble, he said his battery charger had broken last month, and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. The nearest auto parts store was in town, 40 minutes away, and he couldn't drive me there until Monday, when he did his supply run. 3 more days stuck here. I asked about using his landline to call someone, maybe Jerry back in Omaha, but Walter said the phone lines went down in the last storm, and the phone company hadn't come out yet. His words made sense, but something in his tone felt rehearsed, like he'd been expecting these exact questions. I spent that day working the fence, but now every sound from the corn made me stop and stare into those green walls, trying to see between the stalks. That Friday night changed everything. I was lying on the mattress above the garage, windows open because the heat was suffocating when I heard the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't staying in the corn. They were moving along the fence line I'd been repairing, slow and deliberate, occasionally stopping right where I'd been working hours before. I crept to the window and looked down, but the darkness was absolute beyond the small circle of light from Walter's porch bulb. Then I heard the fence wire snap, that distinct metallic twang of tension releasing, followed by another snap, then another. Someone was cutting through my work, destroying what I'd spent days fixing. I grabbed my phone for light and rushed downstairs, but by the time I reached the fence, the footsteps had retreated back into the corn. 3 sections of new wire hung loose, cleanly cut with what must have been wire cutters. The cuts were precise, deliberate, not random vandalism, but something purposeful. Walter barely looked up from his eggs when I told him Saturday morning about the cut fence. Kids from town, he said, probably the same ones who'd been stealing gas from farms all summer. But his hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee mug, and I noticed he kept glancing toward the windows that faced the cornfield. I spent the morning repairing the damaged sections, jumping at every rustle, every bird call. Around noon, I decided to walk the perimeter of the property, looking for tire tracks or footprints, anything that might explain who was doing this. The corn rows ran along 3 sides of Walter's land, with only the front facing the county road clear. As I walked along the eastern edge, where the stalks grew thickest, I found something that made me stop cold. A narrow path cut into the corn, barely visible unless you were looking straight at it. The stalks had been carefully pushed aside, not broken, creating a tunnel that disappeared into the green darkness. Fresh boot prints marked the entrance, the treads still sharp in the dry soil. I stood at that entrance for a long time, listening to the corn move around me, trying to convince myself to follow that path and see where it led. But something primal in my gut screamed against it. Whoever made that trail knew these fields, had probably been using them for weeks or months, maybe longer. They could be waiting in there just far enough and where the light barely reached, watching the entrance. Instead, I backed away and continued my circuit around the property, finding 2 more hidden paths cut into different sections of the field. all of them angled toward the house and garage, like spokes on a wheel with Walter's buildings at the center. That afternoon, I confronted Walter directly, told him about the paths, said someone was definitely living or hiding in his corn. His face went pale, almost gray, and he gripped the kitchen table hard enough that his knuckles went white. Then he told me something that made everything worse. The corn wasn't his. He'd leased those fields to a company 5 years ago, some agricultural outfit from Kansas City, and they planted and harvested without his involvement. He had no idea who worked those fields or when they came through. Saturday night, I barricaded myself in the room above the garage, pushing the dresser against the door and keeping a hammer within reach. Sleep was impossible. Every sound became footsteps. Every gust of wind sounded like breathing. Around midnight, I heard voices, low, muffled, but definitely human, coming from somewhere near the garage. I pressed my ear to the floor and could make out at least 2 different speakers, maybe 3, but couldn't understand the words. They were directly below me in the garage with my dead truck. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes. Then footsteps scattered in different directions, some heading back toward the corn, others moving toward the main house where Walter slept. I watched from my window as a shadow passed through the porch light's glow, tall, wearing what looked like coveralls, carrying something long in one hand. The figure stopped at Walter's front door, stood there for a full minute, then walked back toward the cornfield, disappearing into one of those hidden paths. Sunday morning, Walter wasn't in the kitchen at his usual time. I found him sitting on his porch, staring at the cornfield with hollow eyes, looking like he hadn't slept at all. When I sat down beside him, he started talking without prompting, his voice barely above a whisper. The company that leased his fields, he said. They'd stopped sending checks 2 years ago, stopped answering his calls, but people still came to work the corn. Different people each season, arriving in unmarked vans, never talking to him, never asking permission. He'd tried calling the police once, but the sheriff said without proof of trespassing or crime, there was nothing to investigate. The workers had keys to the equipment shed behind the corn, legal access roads through neighboring properties. Walter suspected they were growing more than corn in those fields, using the dense rows to hide other activities. Maybe drugs, maybe worse. He'd been too scared to look closer, too old to fight back, so he just stayed in his house and pretended not to notice when they came through at night. I told Walter we were leaving immediately, both of us that morning. We could walk to the county road and flag down a car if we had to. But he shook his head, said they'd never let us leave on foot, not in daylight when they could see us from the corn. Our only chance was his truck Monday morning, acting like nothing was wrong, like it was just his regular supply run. Until then, we had to play along, pretend we didn't know anything. That Sunday crawled by in suffocating tension, both of us going through the motions, me pretending to work on the fence, Walter puttering around his yard, both of us avoiding looking at the corn even as we felt eyes watching from within. As darkness fell, Walter handed me his truck keys and an old revolver he'd kept hidden. Only 3 bullets left in the cylinder. He told me to be ready at dawn, to get to his truck fast when he gave the signal. We'd make a run for town and never come back. That night they came for my truck. I watched from my window as 4 figures emerged from different paths in the corn, converging on the garage below. They worked in complete silence, no talking, just efficient movement as they pushed my truck out of the garage and down toward the cornfield. They were taking it somewhere into those rows, probably to strip it for parts or hide it where no one would ever find it. One of them looked up at my window before they disappeared, just stood there staring at where I was hiding behind the curtain, making sure I knew they knew exactly where I was. I gripped Walter's revolver tighter and waited for them to come upstairs, but after a few minutes the figure turned and followed the others into the corn. The message was clear. We were allowed to leave in the morning, but only because they decided to let us go. They owned this place now, not Walter, and everyone involved understood the terms. Monday came with a blood-red sunrise that painted the corn stalks orange. Walter was already in his truck when I sprinted from the garage. expecting someone to emerge from the fields at any moment. But nothing moved except the corn swaying in the morning breeze. We drove down that gravel drive faster than was safe, dust clouding behind us, neither of us speaking until we hit the paved county road. Walter drove straight to the state police station in Grand Island, told them everything while I sat there still clutching his revolver in my jacket pocket. The cops sent units out that afternoon, but they found nothing. No paths in the corn, no footprints, no sign of my truck. Even the cut fence wires had been replaced with new ones. The detective said without evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Walter sold the farm 2 months later to some development company from out of state, took whatever they offered and moved to Arizona to live with his daughter. I never got my truck back, never got paid for the fence work either. Sometimes I search online for news about that area of Nebraska, looking for stories about drug busts or missing persons found in cornfields, but there's never anything. Whatever they were doing out there in those endless rows, they're probably still doing it now, using some other old farmer's land, watching from the corn. October brings out the worst in people, and after working at Frightland Farms for 6 weeks, I thought I'd seen it all. College was draining my bank account faster than my parents predicted, so when I saw the Help Wanted sign for the corn maze back in September, $30 an hour seemed too good to pass up. The maze sprawled across 12 acres of farmland just outside Bakersfield, with walls of corn stalks reaching 8 feet high, and paths that twisted into dead ends designed to make visitors panic. My job was simple enough. Reset the motion-activated props between tours, guide lost families to the exit, and make sure nobody vandalized the animatronic scarecrows. That particular Saturday night, we'd run 7 tours back-to-back, each one packed with screaming teenagers and drunk adults who thought jumping out at other guests was hilarious. By the time we locked the main gate at midnight, my ears were ringing from all the chainsaw sound effects, and dried corn silk had worked its way into every piece of clothing I wore. The parking lot emptied out quickly after closing, leaving just 3 cars: mine, the manager Keith's pickup truck, and a sedan that belonged to Vicky from concessions. Keith had asked me and 2 other guys to stay late for breakdown duty, promising an extra $50 cash if we helped haul the expensive decorations into storage before the rain forecasted for Sunday morning. Most of the electronic stuff needed to come down first: the strobe lights, fog machines, and those motion sensors that triggered recorded screams whenever someone walked past. The other guys started at the entrance while I headed toward the back sections with a wheelbarrow and my phone flashlight, since the overhead lights would shut off automatically at 12:30 to save electricity. The corn rustled in the wind, creating whispers that made me jumpy even though I knew every inch of these paths. I just disconnected the zombie mannequin at checkpoint 4 when the first section of lights went dark, way earlier than scheduled. Then the second section cut out, and the third like someone was flipping breakers in sequence, leaving me stranded in complete darkness, with nothing but my phone's weak beam cutting through the shadows. "Keith," I called out, expecting to hear his gravelly voice boom back from the entrance, but nothing came except the sound of corn stalks brushing against each other. The generator should have kicked in by now. We had backup power specifically for situations like this, installed after some kids got lost in the dark 2 years ago, and their parents threatened to sue. I tried calling Keith's cell, but the screen showed no signal, which wasn't unusual since reception was spotty out here, but the timing made my chest tight. That's when I heard it, a voice answering from somewhere deep in the maze, muffled by the walls of corn but definitely human. "Yeah, coming," it said, but something was wrong with the tone, too high-pitched to be Keith, too cheerful for anyone who'd just worked a 12-hour shift. The voice had that fake quality actors use when they're trying too hard to sound casual, like someone reading lines for the first time. I aimed my phone toward where the sound came from, but the light barely penetrated 5 feet before the darkness swallowed it whole. My first instinct was to head back toward the entrance, but the path behind me looked identical to the one ahead, just walls of corn pressing in from both sides. We'd designed the maze to disorient people during daylight hours, and now, in pitch darkness with my phone battery at 30%, every turn looked the same. Another sound cut through the rustling, and this time it was definitely laughter. Not from the speakers we'd installed at corner posts, but from somewhere between the rows, like someone was standing just behind the corn wall next to me. The laugh had that unhinged quality drunk people get when they think they're being funny, but they're really just being creepy, drawn out, and ending in a wheeze. "Real hilarious, guys," I shouted, figuring it was probably Brett and Miguel trying to mess with me, but my voice cracked halfway through. The laughter stopped immediately, replaced by footsteps, not on the packed dirt paths, but pushing through the corn itself, snapping stalks as whoever it was forced their way through the walls instead of using the maze routes. The wheelbarrow I'd been pushing sat abandoned behind me somewhere, and I couldn't remember which checkpoint I'd passed last. Every horror movie I'd ever watched screamed at me not to investigate, to just run, but running blind through a maze designed to trap people seemed equally stupid. My phone flashlight started flickering, not dying completely but stuttering like a strobe light, which made the shadows between the corn rows jump and dance. During one of the dark moments, I caught a glimpse of something pale moving parallel to me through the stalks, keeping pace but never quite showing itself fully. The smell hit me then, not the earthy scent of corn and soil I'd gotten used to, but something chemical and wrong, like rubber burning mixed with that sickly sweet stench of spilled energy drinks. Whoever this was had been here a while, maybe since before we opened for the evening tours, waiting in some corner we never checked. The thought made bile rise in my throat because we'd had hundreds of people walk through here tonight, including families with little kids, and this person had been watching the whole time. I forced myself to think logically about the maze layout. The exit was always northeast from any point. That's how we'd mapped it for emergency situations. But without the overhead lights or the glowing arrows we put up for the younger kids' tours, northeast meant nothing. The footsteps had stopped, which somehow felt worse than hearing them because now I had no idea where the person was. Then my phone started ringing, the sound impossibly loud in the silence, Keith's name lighting up the screen. Relief flooded through me as I answered, but the voice that came through wasn't Keith's. "Having fun yet?" the same high-pitched voice from earlier asked, and I realized with cold certainty that whoever was in here with me had Keith's phone. The line went dead before I could respond, and when I looked at my screen, my battery had dropped to 20%, even though it had been at 30 just minutes ago. The corn to my left suddenly parted, stalks bending outward like something large was pushing through, and I saw fingers, too long with dirt caked under the nails, reaching through the gap toward where I stood. I stumbled backward and ran, not caring anymore about finding the exit, just needing to put distance between me and those reaching fingers. The maze paths forked and twisted, and I took turns at random, my breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed off the corn walls. Behind me, I could hear pursuit, not running but walking steadily, calmly, like whoever it was knew exactly where I would end up. They started whistling, the tune familiar but wrong, like a children's song played in a minor key. My phone light caught a reflection ahead, metal gleaming in the darkness, and I recognized one of our emergency exit signs, the ones we installed after the lawsuit threat. The gate was padlocked, of course, but the fence was only 6 feet high, chain link that I could climb if I could just reach it. 20 more yards, 15, 10, and then something wrapped around my ankle, sending me sprawling face first into the dirt path. When I rolled over, gasping and spitting out soil, I saw what had tripped me. A foam machete from one of our props, but attached to it was a note written in what looked like brown marker. "You walked past me 17 times tonight." The whistling had stopped, and in the sudden quiet, I heard something that made my situation infinitely worse. Multiple voices, at least 3, maybe 4, all whispering in unison from different parts of the maze. They were coordinating, I realized, using the paths to herd me towards something. My phone finally died, plunging me into absolute darkness just as I heard the chain link fence rattle somewhere to my right. They were climbing it, blocking my escape route. The whispering grew louder and I could make out words now. Section 3 clear. He's moving toward checkpoint 7. Block the maintenance gate. These weren't random creeps who'd hidden after hours. They'd studied our maze, learned our procedures, maybe even taken one of our employee maps from the break room. The smell was stronger now, and I realized why it seemed familiar. It was the same combination of smells from the storage unit where we kept the old decorations, the ones from 5 years ago when an employee named Curtis had disappeared during breakdown and never been found. We joked about it sometimes, called it the Curtis curse, but right now, crouched in the dirt with strangers surrounding me, I wondered if maybe Curtis hadn't disappeared at all. The ground beneath me vibrated slightly, and I heard the unmistakable sound of our industrial wood chipper starting up somewhere near the maintenance shed. We used it to mulch the corn stalks after the season ended, but hearing it now, in the dark with these people hunting me, sent ice through my veins. They weren't just trying to scare me. They had access to our equipment, knew where we kept the keys. A flashlight beam suddenly cut through the darkness about 50 feet away, sweeping back and forth methodically. And in its glow, I saw a figure wearing one of our employee uniforms from years ago. The old green ones we'd replaced with red ones 3 seasons back. The person holding the light was tall, skeletal thin, with hair that hung in greasy strands over their face. When they turned slightly, I caught a glimpse of their smile, too wide, showing too many teeth like they'd been practicing it in a mirror but couldn't quite get it right. "Found you," they sang out in that high-pitched voice, and 2 more flashlights clicked on from different directions, forming a triangle with me at the center. Something inside me snapped then, not breaking but hardening into pure survival instinct. I grabbed handful after handful of dirt and started throwing it at the nearest flashlight, then dove through the corn wall to my left, not caring about the stalks cutting my face and arms. The corn rows weren't planted in perfect lines. There were gaps if you knew where to look, spaces where the irrigation system created natural corridors. I'd spent 6 weeks learning every inch of this place, and now that knowledge was the only thing keeping me alive. Behind me, I heard them crashing through the corn, no longer coordinated, angry now. The wood chipper's sound grew louder as I headed toward it, which seemed insane, but I remembered something. The maintenance shed had a landline, an old phone that connected directly to the security company. If I could get there first, if I could lock myself in and make that call, maybe I'd survive this. The shed appeared in the darkness, a darker shadow against the night sky, and I could see the door was open, swinging slightly in the wind. The smart thing would be to avoid it, to know it was a trap, but I could hear them getting closer, and the sound of the wood chipper meant someone was already there, waiting. I burst through the shed door and immediately saw Keith, tied to a chair with orange extension cords, duct tape over his mouth, his eyes wide with terror, but alive. The wood chipper sat in the corner, running empty, just making noise to lure me here. Before I could move toward Keith, the door slammed shut behind me, and the skeletal figure stepped out from behind a stack of fertilizer bags. Up close, I could see their face clearly. Hollow cheeks, eyes that didn't blink enough, and that horrible smile that looked carved into their face. "You lasted longer than Curtis," they said in that sing-song voice, pulling something from their pocket that gleamed silver in the dim light from the emergency exit sign. It was a set of keys. Car keys, house keys, and smaller keys I recognized as the ones from our employee lockers. Dozens of sets, all on different rings, some rusty, some new, and I understood with sickening clarity that Curtis wasn't there first, and I wouldn't be there last. They took a step toward me, and I grabbed the first thing I could reach, a canister of pesticide spray we used for wasp nests. The label warned about eye contact, about permanent damage, about keeping away from open flames, and I remembered the lighter in my pocket from my smoke break 6 hours ago, back when my biggest worry was a statistics midterm. What happened next took maybe 10 seconds, but I can still see every detail when I close my eyes. I sprayed the pesticide directly at their face while flicking the lighter with my other hand, creating a makeshift flamethrower that sent them stumbling backward, screaming in a voice that finally sounded human. The others burst through the door just as the pesticide canister emptied, and in the chaos, I managed to cut Keith free with a box cutter from the workbench. We ran toward his truck while they tried to help their leader, whose face was a mess of chemical burns and singed hair. Keith's hands shook so badly I had to dig the keys from his pocket myself, and we peeled out of there, gravel spraying, while 3 figures stood in the parking lot watching us go. The police found evidence of at least 12 different people who'd gone missing from corn mazes across 3 states over the past 8 years, all during the Halloween season. They arrested 4 people living in an abandoned farmhouse 2 miles from Frightland Farms, and during the trial, we learned they'd been employees at various mazes over the years, learning layouts, studying procedures, choosing victims who stayed late. The wood chipper had been cleaned with bleach so many times the metal was pitted, but forensics still found traces. I finished college, got my degree, moved to Portland where there's no farmland for miles, but every October when the leaves change and people start decorating for Halloween, I smell that mixture of burnt rubber and energy drinks, and I remember those fingers reaching through the corn. The Corn Maze Festival had always been the highlight of autumn in our town. Families came from neighboring counties to eat fried dough, take hay rides, and get lost among the tall golden rows that stretched beyond the church steeple. I helped with parking that year, waving cars toward the muddy field behind the grain silo. It was supposed to be an ordinary weekend. Warm cider, local bands, kids running with flashlights through the stalks. No one imagined that before the night was over, a 17-year-old named Tyler Green would vanish without a trace. I remember hearing his name for the first time over the loudspeaker. The announcer's voice cracked halfway through, like he did not quite believe what he was saying. People laughed at first, thinking it was a prank. Tyler had entered the maze around 6 in the evening with 3 friends, and by dusk, he had separated from them. They assumed he went out another exit, but when the fireworks started at 9, his parents realized he was not anywhere near the crowd. That is when the panic began to spread through the fairgrounds, quiet at first, like wind stirring the stalks before a storm. By midnight, the sheriff's deputies had blocked the roads leading to the farms, and volunteers were forming lines at the edge of the maze. I joined them, holding a lantern borrowed from my father's shed. The smell of wet earth and gasoline filled the air. Every few yards, someone shouted Tyler's name, and the sound was swallowed by the corn. Flashlights danced through the fog, catching glimpses of scarecrows, boots half buried in mud, and once, a child's lost mitten that made a woman scream before realizing it was pink, not blue like Tyler's. The search stretched into the early hours, and the field began to feel endless. When the sun rose, we saw how far we had wandered. The maze sat between 3 farms, their property lines marked by rusted wire and piles of rotting hay. A man named Roger Jenkins brought coffee in a thermos and pointed to tire tracks near the drainage ditch. He said they were fresh, still pressed deep into the mud from the night before. The sheriff crouched beside them, tracing the pattern with a stick, and his face tightened. Word spread fast that the tread matched a pickup belonging to Tyler's neighbor, a quiet mechanic named Paul Hewitt. By noon, no one was talking about an accident anymore. The sheriff questioned Paul right there at the field, his wife standing behind him, arms folded tight against the morning chill. Paul kept saying he had gone home early, that his truck had not left the driveway since supper time. But everyone in town knew his tires. He used a distinctive snow tread year-round, claiming it gave him better traction in mud. While deputies searched his property, the rest of us stayed behind, combing through the maze row by row. Around mid-afternoon, one of the volunteer teams radioed that they had found a roll of duct tape half buried under a pile of stalks. It looked like it had been torn in a hurry, silver edges still sticky with dirt and grass. After that, everything changed. The fairgrounds that had been filled with chatter went dead silent, except for the sound of engines starting as more people joined the search. The duct tape was placed in a plastic bag and carried toward the sheriff's car like it was made of glass. A deputy muttered something about fingerprints and another pointed toward a broken flashlight lying a few yards away. Someone swore they had seen that same brand in Paul's garage last week. By then, everyone's face had turned pale, and whispers replaced words. It felt as if the entire town was holding its breath, afraid of what would come next. Later that evening, the sky turned a strange amber color, the kind you see before heavy rain. The wind made the corn hiss and shift, creating shapes that looked like people moving between the rows. We kept walking in lines, calling Tyler's name, but it started to sound meaningless. Some of the older men brought dogs, though the animals refused to go near the northern edge of the field. That was where we found the torn piece of blue fabric caught on a barbed wire fence. It matched the color of the hoodie Tyler had been wearing. The air around us felt heavy, and no one said a word as the sheriff wrapped it in another evidence bag. When night came again, the searchlights turned the field into a sea of shadows. The sheriff ordered everyone back to the fairgrounds to regroup, but a few of us stayed behind near the drainage ditch, where the tire marks had been found. That was when Roger noticed something in the water, a small silver chain tangled around a branch. It had a pendant shaped like a baseball, and Tyler's mother confirmed later that it belonged to him. The sheriff looked more exhausted than I had ever seen him. He said they would start digging near the ditch at first light. I went home that night muddy to my knees, but I could not bring myself to wash my boots. When dawn came, the air was thick with fog. Deputies marked off a wide area near the ditch and brought in shovels. A local news van arrived, its camera catching every movement. I stood behind the barrier tape with a few others, unable to leave. After about 20 minutes, one of the deputies called for the sheriff. They had uncovered something wrapped in a tarp, small, dark, and unmistakably human-shaped. The sheriff told the reporters to turn off their cameras, but everyone already knew. A woman behind me began sobbing, and someone else yelled that Paul should be dragged out of his house that instant. Paul was taken into custody that afternoon, though no one saw the evidence they had against him. His wife packed their belongings that same evening and drove away without saying goodbye to anyone. For a few weeks, the town lived in a fog of suspicion. Neighbors stopped talking to each other. Parents refused to let their kids walk alone, and even the church potluck was canceled. The sheriff said the investigation was still ongoing, but no charges were ever filed. People whispered that something about the evidence did not add up, that the tire marks might have been a coincidence. Still, no one dared to question the official story too loudly. Months passed, and the cornfields grew bare again. The festival was canceled the following year, replaced by a simple memorial service near the ditch. I stood there, watching the wind move through the dry stalks, and realized how quiet everything had become. It was not just grief. It was fear. Fear that someone still among us had done it. Fear that we might never really know. Sometimes when I drive past that field at night, I see flashlights flickering between the rows, like the search never ended. I know they are not real, but I still slow down and watch them until they fade. I have not been back since. The field was sold to a developer last spring, and they say new houses will be built where the maze once stood. People like to believe that time heals, but in our town it only buried what we could not face. Every autumn, when the air smells like wet hay and smoke, I think of Tyler, his blue hoodie, the pendant in the ditch, the silence that followed. None of us talk about it anymore, but every one of us remembers the night the search began, and the morning we wished we had never found what we were looking for. It happened during my senior year, after one of our late fall soccer practices. The days were already short, and by the time the bus left the school parking lot, the sky had that bruised purple color that means the sun is almost gone. There were 12 of us, plus our driver, Mr. Daly, a quiet man who always had an old thermos of coffee that smelled like burnt toast. Everyone was tired, still in our uniforms, our shoes muddy, music playing low from someone's speaker near the back. It felt like any other ride home, except for the route, a detour through a narrow road that cut between cornfields because of roadwork near town. About 20 minutes in, the engine made this coughing sound and the whole bus shuddered like it had hiccups. Mr. Daly tried to restart it, but after a few attempts, it just went silent. The air inside turned heavy, no hum of the motor, only the whisper of wind against the windows and the tall corn brushing along the sides. He told us to stay put while he went to look for help, said there was a farmhouse not far down the road. He grabbed his jacket, stepped out, and the door's pneumatic hiss was the last clear sound before everything felt strangely hollow. We waited, maybe 10 minutes at first, then 20. The light outside kept fading until all we could see through the glass was the dull reflection of ourselves and a thin stripe of orange horizon. Someone cracked a joke about ghosts in the corn to break the tension, but it didn't land. One of the younger students, Ellie, started recording on her phone, trying to capture how creepy the field looked, just rows of stalks waving in the wind. The video's still online, I think, but the last part is what got people talking, because after the laughter faded, there were footsteps, not Mr. Daly's, slower, uneven, circling the bus. At first we thought maybe it was him, or someone from the farmhouse he mentioned, but when Ellie called out, there was no reply. Just that rhythm of steps shifting through the dirt, stopping, then starting again from a different side. The kind of sound that doesn't match any pattern you recognize. Someone tried to use their phone flashlight to look outside, but the glare bounced off the glass, and it only made things worse, like we were trapped in our own reflection. That was when we heard the first tap on the side panel, light but deliberate near the emergency exit window. The tapping came again, this time closer to where we sat. It was faint, like the tip of a coin against metal, but steady enough that no one spoke over it. Someone whispered that maybe the wind was moving the stalks, but there was no wind strong enough to make that sound. Then came a scrape, long, dragging, along the length of the bus. It traveled slowly, almost as if whoever or whatever was outside was testing each panel. A few of us stood up and tried to look through the windows on that side, but it was useless. The corn was too dense, and everything beyond the glass looked like shifting shadows. Ellie stopped recording when the sound reached the back door. Her phone light flickered once, and I remember her face going pale in that dim glow. Mr. Daly had been gone nearly 40 minutes by then. We tried to convince ourselves that he was just lost, that maybe he had gone the wrong way down the road. One of the older boys, Ethan, said we should go find him, but nobody wanted to step outside first. It was strange. None of us said we were scared, but nobody moved either. The silence between us said everything. At some point, a pair of headlights appeared far down the road, faint but real. Everyone rushed to the front thinking help had come, but the lights never got closer. They just hovered there, distant and still, like whoever was driving had stopped in the middle of the road. When they finally blinked out, it felt like the night got heavier. The air turned colder inside the bus, though none of the windows were open. I could smell something faint then, wet dirt and something like rust. That was when the footsteps returned, faster this time, circling again. But there were more of them, too many. It sounded like a crowd walking through the field just out of sight, moving in patterns that made no sense. The rhythm of it built until the sound was coming from both sides, and a low voice, maybe 2 or 3 of them, started whispering our names. Not all of us, just a few. Mine was one of them. No one said anything after that. We just sat there, waiting until someone at the back said they saw a light inside the corn rows. The light was small, maybe the size of a lantern, weaving between the stalks as if someone was carrying it low. We all crowded toward the windows, but the glass fogged with our breath. I remember wiping it clear with my sleeve and seeing the light stop halfway to the bus. Then another one appeared behind it, and another, 3 in total, flickering like weak flashlights. For a moment, we were sure it was Mr. Daly bringing help, and the relief hit all at once, until one of the lights started moving upward, high above the corn, like it was floating. The other 2 stayed still. The laughter we expected never came. No voices. Just that steady shuffle of footsteps drawing closer again. Someone yelled that we needed to get out. Panic spread quick. Ethan pulled the emergency lever, and cold air rushed in with the smell of soil and something metallic. We climbed down one by one, our sneakers sinking into the soft dirt. The field surrounded us on every side, the corn towering higher than our heads. The bus lights flickered once behind us, then went dark. Nobody said a word after that. It was as if sound itself didn't want to exist out there. The only thing we could hear was breathing, ours, and something else pacing in rhythm just beyond the rows. When the police found me, it was already morning. I was sitting in the middle of the road, wrapped in one of those silver rescue blankets, staring at the spot where the bus had been. They said they found it a mile away. Engine still cold, door open, no one inside. Every other student was gone. The only thing left was Ellie's phone wedged under one of the seats. They played part of the last recording for me later. Those footsteps, the low whisper, and then what sounded like wind passing through the microphone before it cuts off completely. I wish I could tell you more, but I do not remember anything after running into the corn. To this day, no one has found the others, not even a piece of clothing or a footprint beyond the road. The official report says the bus rolled down a slope and got stuck, that the kids must have wandered off in confusion. But I still hear it sometimes when I drive past empty fields at dusk, the same rhythm of steps brushing through dry stalks, circling, waiting. The sound follows the car for a while, then fades when the light is gone. That night feels like it never ended, like part of me is still sitting on that bus, watching those three lights sway in the dark.